You are live. You may begin.
Thank you very much, Fortis. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristen Wong-Tam, City Councillor, and I'm the chair of the Two-Spirited Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer Advisory Committee. My pronouns are they, them, she, her, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you back to our very first meeting of 2022. I hope you had a nice winter break. The committee secretary has confirmed that we do have quorum, so I will call the meeting to order and we will begin. The meeting is being held using the City of Toronto's WebEx technology with members and staff connecting by video conference or calling in. This is one of those meetings where every single one of us is meeting remotely outside of City Hall, except for perhaps the mayor and myself who are in our individual offices. Because we are all meeting remotely, we ask you for your patience with any delays and technical issues. Members of the public can watch the meeting, of course, streaming live on YouTube at youtube.com/Toronto City Council Live. We do not have any registered speakers today. I would like to request staff to keep your microphones muted and your video turned off unless you are ready to address the committee. It will make it easier for myself as chair to see the members as we debate and vote on each item agenda. Members, please keep your microphones on mute unless you wish to question staff or speak to an item. If members wish to ask questions of staff or to speak, please make sure your video is on and to raise your hand or unmute your microphone and indicate your intention to speak, and I will then create a speakers list. Please note that certain interactive features of WebEx, such as raise hand, are disabled. The chat feature has been disabled as a communication tool for meeting participants and may be used for technical troubleshooting only. Any chats you type will go directly to technical support staff who are here supporting our meeting. And of course, when voting on an item or motion, I ask members to turn on your video and raise your hand to indicate your vote. If there is a recorded vote, you will be asked to state if you are voting in favor or opposed. And members, I want to remind all of you, and I know you know this rule very well, that since we are meeting remotely and participating remotely, we need to have your motions submitted in advance. The clerk staff are here to help you draft any of those motions. And although we're meeting in different locations and we're meeting remotely, the 2S LGBT Advisory Committee acknowledges the land that we're meeting on is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. Toronto remains home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and we, of course, acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I will now call for declarations of interest. Please let me know if you have any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. And if you do declare an interest, please indicate that item number and the nature of your interest. If you have an interest, please raise your hand or unmute your microphone to let me know. Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. May I have a motion to confirm the minutes of our last committee meeting on December 8th, 2021? Thank you very much, Terrence. I see your hand. All those in favor of adopting the minutes? Thank you. Any opposed? That carries. Thank you. We will now consider the 5 items on our agenda. We have the first item, which is QS 5.1, vacancy on the Two-Spirited LGBTQ Advisory Committee. This item is only for information and placed on the agenda by the clerk to formally advise of a vacancy on our committee. Our table has grown smaller by 1, and as JC Elijah Buwa has resigned from our committee. We want to thank Eli for all his hard work and wish him the best of luck in future endeavors. Do I have a member who can move this item for me to receive? Thank you, Susan. All those in favor? Any contrary minded? That passes. Thank you very much. Our next item is a very special item. We have a special guest who's joined us today, and that is, of course, Mayor Tory. Mayor Tory is here to address the committee. He's graciously offered to take any questions at the end of his presentation, and if you can do that by unmuting and letting me know if you have questions, and we can begin. Mayor Tory, welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, Chair Kristen, thank you very much. And can I just begin by saying thank you? I don't get a chance often enough with all the people we have in different areas of the community that step up and give their time to help us with these things. And I'm going to make reference to the fact that I think this committee is already making a real difference, and I can point to specific examples of that. But you know, we this one was birthed, you know, through some of the advocacy of Councillor Wong Tam, but also you know, my own belief that we have to have and need to have and should have bodies like this that help us, because as much as we try to keep our ear to the ground and understand you know, understand some of the needs of particular groups in the community, it's very difficult to do that when you're whether a councillor or the mayor or even a senior public servant in a city of this size. And so I just want to thank you for stepping up. And I want to say at the outset that I'm very committed to this. And, you know, there'll be people on this committee as there are in the population at large. And when you're the mayor of a city of 3 million people, there are going to be people every day who disagree with you on something. And, you know, I've tried to, you know, work hard to ensure that people know that I'm committed, that I'm trying to listen and learn all the time, that, you know, I'm trying to do the right thing in terms of my own conduct of the responsibilities that I have. But, you know, there are going to be times when that won't be to your liking as much as others. And I just think we have to keep working at that. And I certainly feel that bodies like this, you know, I know sort of what I am and who I am in the context of my own background and where I came from, and therefore the things that I'm going to be more familiar with than others in terms of my own life experience. And so you have to, as anybody does in a position of leadership, rely on the lived experience and the wisdom of others to try and help guide you to the right place. I sort of proceed, you know, in terms of how I try to um, do my job, especially when it comes to you know, looking at the experience of and trying to improve the experience of groups that are marginalized, discriminated against, or otherwise just not, you know, given their due. I sort of use a phrase that isn't meant to be a catchphrase by any means, but it sort of guides me a little bit in terms of saying, well, you have to stand up, you have to speak up, you have to show up, and you have to act. And with the acting part being, you know, the most important part. And you know, the standing up is obvious, and that is in particular in application to instances of any kind of hate or discrimination. And I hope that you would find that I'm you know, quite vocal on that. And there's many instances, unfortunately, although we're blessed as a city compared to many other places, there's still many instances that happen even this week if you go and look. You know, there have been things that have happened in the public domain that you know, required me to speak up. And the standing up and speaking up, I think, are self-evident. The showing up is something that I hope you've noticed I try to do, like literally physically be present in places to, and I think that's my job because it sends a message, but it also, I hope, provides a degree of comfort that the elected leader of the city, whoever that is a person who, you know, will show up to offer support. But then the action part, I think, is something that, you know, puts us really to the test. All of us who are in positions of public service, whether they be elected or public servants themselves. And I just wanted to talk to you about a couple of examples of places where we're trying to be more sensitive. So I'm using those words because I don't for a minute, you know, sit here in front of you and, you know, pretend we've got any of these problems solved. A lot of them are problems that I've been on this in this job for 7.5 years now, and a lot of them are incredibly difficult, complex problems, and that I think even my biggest critic would acknowledge that whoever that is would acknowledge that they don't have simple answers. I mean, they're just, you know, incredibly complex, difficult problems. But if you look at one that fits into that category, incredibly difficult, complex problem, as it relates to the 2S LGBTQ plus communities, um, the issue of shelters and homelessness and housing is something where, first of all, I acknowledge this group and members of this group have been working directly, and this is the way I want it, and I know the way Councillor Wong Tam wants it, working directly with our housing officials to help to ensure that the particular needs of those communities are addressed in the various policies and things that we do. And so, for example, we have, and I've been, by the way, I was sensitized to this many years ago because I think as Councillor Wong Tam knows for sure, and some of you, Susan, knows, I make it my practice, and one of the reasons I'm seen out in the community so much is a lot of that is for me to educate myself about things I don't know about. And I just remember how impactful it was on me because a lot of people, including me, perhaps 15, I don't know, 20 years ago, long before I was mayor, might have wondered, well, why did we have the Pink Triangle School? And when I went, to the Pink Triangle School in those days under the auspices of Brent Hawkes, meaning he took me there and I met the people from the school board, I understood very well, after that visit. And it doesn't take one visit to completely educate you, why there was a safe space needed, because I met some of the kids who told me of their experiences and why they needed something that was a bit different to meet their needs and to provide them with the supports they needed. And similarly, we have acted on putting in place some safe spaces when it comes to shelters and so on. And, one most recently created, others before that. And I'm very fond of citing when I'm out, and as I have been this entire summer, across the city supporting supportive housing developments we put in. And the initial reaction of the neighborhood is to say, well, it's going to be populated by thieves and crooks and drug users. This is the way they talk. And I have to say, well, no, actually, our experience is quite otherwise. And I'm so proud of the one that's over by Spadina and Bloor, of the fact that, the neighborhood actually ended up, and I predicted this is what would happen with all of these places we established as safe spaces, that they will be adopted by the community, become part of the community, and that the two groups, which may start off being a bit hesitant, will work with each other. And I think that's a huge part of community building. But I'll just say that we've tried to be sensitive to the particular needs of these communities that are represented here today in establishing that policy. And I'm very pleased to hear more from you when we get to the question period, if there are some questions about that. Substance use. I mean, this is an area where I can tell you, you directly already have had an impact on public policy, in that your recommendation came forward to the executive committee and to city council to establish a drug policy. I think it was fashioned in slightly different words, as it applies particularly to the needs of and the experiences of people in the 2S LGBTQ plus communities. And, that's an example already where not just the working with the housing officials on shelter and homelessness related issues, but this one where you've got us now developing such a policy because you suggested that would be best to be done. I look at policing, and there's lots to be done there. I'm a member of the police board, and I acknowledge that, although I think there's not as much credit given as there might be for what is being done by way of very significant changes that are taking place. But, I was a major force behind the appointment of Gloria Epstein to do the independent review of what happened with respect to missing persons. And then she prepared an excellent report that is of global standard in terms of what's said. But one of the things that was in it that was a very local import was the fact that when it came to missing persons, we were just not applying the resources that other cities were, and that even the law, as it were, provided that we should. And that is a significant component of the police budget, of which you'll hear much this year. And I'm sure there are varying opinions about it on this group. But the fact is, we're putting the resources to work in the millions of dollars to put the people in place to make sure that missing persons can be dealt with in a way that would meet with your approval, compared to the standard that was not acceptable before. Similarly, the hate crime has been doubled. The hate crime unit has been doubled in size to deal with, unfortunately, what is still, as I say, a problem I think that is relatively better than it is in other cities, but nonetheless a problem that is continuing to grow in terms of its, and this is the reported cases. And of course, they still include a number of reported cases of involving people from the 2S LGBTQ plus communities. And then finally, I think something that is yet unheralded in terms of just how important a step forward that it is, but I think it's responsive to the views that I've heard a number of you express over time, which is the creation, approved also by City Council last week, of a civilian mental health professional-led crisis response unit, so that you will now have, starting next month, it's rolling out over the course of this year, significant portions, in fact, the portions of the city we chose to try this. And I'm quite happy to answer your questions as to why we're sort of trying it on a pilot project basis, although it's a big pilot. It's not like some tiny little 3-block area of the city. We picked the 4 greatest areas of the city that have the greatest numbers of persons in distress calls, and that's where we're rolling this out. But I think you'd agree that when you're doing something as untried as that for the first time, you're wise to see how it works and to take on as much as you can. And these 4 big areas of the city with the greatest numbers of persons in distress calls, I think, will be a challenge for us to take on. But what you will have there, in simple terms, is mental health professionals, not police, answering those calls. And they'll be triaged with the help of mental health professionals, so that where the police may be needed, which in some cases I think we would all acknowledge they might be, they'll get those. But otherwise, you're going to have a large number of these calls now dealt with by this civilian response unit. And So that, and then I would just mention finally the handling of the pandemic. And I hope you would believe, because it's been a fundamental tenet of ours. When I say ours, there's been a relatively small group overseeing the management of the pandemic. That's myself, Dr. Davila, of course, Chief Peg, and Councillor Cressy as the chair of the Board of Health. And we have tried very hard to set a standard that I hope is the gold standard with respect to doing two things. One, making sure that we can address the specific needs of more vulnerable or marginalized or communities with having greater trouble with access to the system, or even trouble with their relationship with the system on issues of trust that have built up over time. And secondly, special outreach that we have done to make sure that when it comes to things like vaccination, that the situation that has prevailed here, where we've had far lesser numbers of people getting vaccinated in some of these more marginalized, isolated communities, we're making a special effort to include them. And, it's still a big, big challenge for us. I can talk to you about that as well, but we've had quite a bit of success because we focused on it, and because we have just decided we were not going to leave people behind who might have had these issues that are sometimes very historic in nature. But the one, that I think we still have work to do on, and it's a very practical kind of thing. But again, sometimes we focus in these committees very much on kind of, I'll call them social issues, and issues of equity from the standpoint of discrimination and things like that. I think we have work to do on opportunity, economic opportunity. I think there is still a very strong, arguable case that people from the 2S LGBTQ plus communities are not included in the opportunities that lie in front of us. And I'm a believer, by the way, that I think this city has every reason to be hopeful as we emerge out of the pandemic, because all the fundamentals that had us booming as a city before the pandemic are still there. But one of the realities of what was going on before the pandemic is that that boom was not being shared in by everybody. And there were various communities, and I have been taking quite a bit of time. And I'll say that I've attended and been part of more efforts, for example, that try to deal with issues of anti-Black racism and the impact on that community, or those communities in Toronto, with regard to employment and opportunity, than I have with the 2S LGBTQ2S plus. But I would say that aside from some encounters I've had with the LGBTQS Chamber of Commerce, where I've tried to help them with their activities, that I would welcome any advice and interaction we might have on that issue, because I think it's a very important issue, not unrelated to all the others. Communities are marginalized, and this, many of you better than me, but for a whole number of reasons. But that sometimes can start with a lack of economic opportunity and insecurity that leads people to then, end up with other problems, including with housing, and including with a whole bunch of issues. And then finally, I've tried to be very active on the issue of culture. And of course, I think we've done a really good job. I think something I'm very proud of, our Year of Public Art has involved 1,500 artists, but I can say that many of them are not only BIPOC, but artists that are from and have immense stories to tell, and talent to show from the 2S LGBTQ plus communities. And I'm proud of how that has gone so far as an inclusive thing, but it's turned out to be an economic savior too for a lot of artists. And I'm very committed to this city, because I think everything goes together in terms of the degree to which you sort of become an inclusive city, but also the arts and culture, and having people tell their stories and be able to do so are part of creating the kind of city that we want to live in. Finally, and I'm sorry I've taken so long, Chair, but it's a rare opportunity for me to appear in front of a committee like this. I've tried to be a voice of reason, and these are things that come from my heart, so they're not politically manufactured, and therefore it would be very difficult to talk me out of, you have to sort of speak from your heart, and you're accountable for that when we have elections. I'm deeply disturbed, and yesterday I tried to sort of articulate it in a way I do. I know that some of you would say I don't light my hair on fire very often, because it's just not in my nature, but I'm deeply disturbed by, and it doesn't relate as much most of the time, fortunately, to 2S LGBTQ plus communities, but the polarization that's going on out there, to me, is just deeply disturbing as a Canadian, as somebody who spent my whole life living in this city. And I think we've been, relatively, I don't want to say isolated from it, but there's been less of it here seemingly than there has been elsewhere. But you're still seeing it show up just in the discourse and things like that. And I try to, remind people of the fact that we have sort of collective responsibilities, and a collective responsibility to look after each other, and a collective responsibility to, to safeguard each other's rights, not just my rights or your rights, but each other's rights, because they do intersect in many different ways. And that's another place where this community can be very helpful. But I'm worried about that, because I see it sort of tearing at this, this strengthening social consensus that we have. It's strengthening. It's still got, we have so much to do. And you know, the problems, as I said, that are intractable. I mean, mental health, I could have talked about that, substance, you know, use issues, homelessness. I mean, these are problems that, you know, never go away. The more you do, the more you have left to do. And that's not a complaint. That's just a statement of fact. So again, I'll just finish the way I did. I'll thank the chair for all the efforts that, as a counselor, that she makes in leading this group and leading to its establishment, quite frankly. And I thank you for agreeing to serve on it. And I look forward to any questions or comments you have now. And I want you to feel anytime you can approach me. And you know, because I sort of know who I am and I know where I've come from, and I'm not apologizing for that. You are who everybody is, who they are. But it means I always have a lot to learn. One of the great things about life is you wake up every morning and you know by the end of the day you've learned 6 new things because you just kept your eyes and your ears open and you wanted to learn. So, and I still do, even at my advanced stage. So thank you very much for your attention this morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. It's wonderful to have, yes, let's give him a round of applause. It's wonderful to have you here today and this morning. We know how busy you are, and we really appreciate the time that you've taken. It's actually, to be quite honest, an honor, because oftentimes the advisory committees that are comprised of citizens of Toronto don't get to see their mayor very often. So this is a very special treat. Okay, so as the mayor has suggested, that if you have any questions or feedback or comments, please let us know. I'm going to do the very best I can to moderate and just indicate your request to speak. I see Laurie's hand. Thank you, Laurie. Anyone else? And Ranjit, thank you. And Laura and Laurie, sorry about that. And Susan, I saw your hand. Thank you. Okay, so we'll start there. Laura, please go first.
Miigwech, thanks for speaking to us and for coming in and talking. It's great to have representation, and leadership representation matters. I have a couple of pieces of questions. So the first, I'll fully admit that I've had bad experiences with the police, in which they triggered some panic attacks. It was not good, and then dealt with it very badly. Something I don't think that training can dismantle systemic violence, but something I do think city workers need, including the police, is trauma-informed facilitation and trauma-informed training. So let's move past some of the here are nice words to use and how not to be racist. And I think they need some very serious work around what to do around trauma-informed care, because ultimately our community has experienced a lot of violence. And then the second question I have, less of a comment, more of a question. I worked on the project to decriminalize, to put in the decriminalization ask for Toronto. I did a lot of the one-on-one interviews. And something a lot of the community mentioned there was the need for 24-hour safe consumption sites and safe housing that allowed for safe consumption sites to also be present. So I'm just wondering on where that decriminalization is and what our city stance is around how we're approaching safe consumption sites to make them safe for the 2S LGBT community.
Well, thank you for those questions. And I will just say to you, first, I'll deal with the second issue first. I had a meeting this week with Carolyn Bennett, the minister in Ottawa, who is now in charge, and I'm very glad actually they have somebody with her background as well that is in charge of mental health and substance-related issues. And I would just say that they are seized of the request that we have made. They, I think, are busier dealing with Vancouver because it's further ahead, meaning in time, than we are. And I don't view that as a bad thing necessarily, because I think we can watch the discussions that go on between Vancouver, British Columbia, and the federal government as a guide to help us to sort of see our way through to, to the right result. I'm pleased at the fact there is a consensus in this community, and I'll say that consensus as between the police chief, myself, the Board of Health, and so on. I will say that, mindful of the fact that one of the things that I believe very strongly, and I've talked to the minister about this, is we have to make sure we develop, as we did, I believe, successfully for safe consumption sites, a consensus in the community, so it doesn't become one of those polarized issues. That would be a disaster, I think, from the standpoint of doing good. So I think that is going to be moving forward. I don't think it'll move forward, to be honest. We did discuss as well the sort of very much related issue, obviously, of safe supply at the same time with her. because that's going to require more leadership on their part, including with the issue of cost. Because I think, as you would know, ensuring safe supply is a very expensive matter for whatever government ends up paying for it, and we end up in this ping pong, game where the one government we know is unable financially to pay for it is this one, municipal, but the other two kind of bat this back and forth. So I would say that is moving forward. It's under very active consideration by them. I think they're trying to make sure that they deal with it in a way that maintains public confidence, including here in the biggest city in the country, and they're using their own experiences with Vancouver to help guide them in that. And I'm not upset by that. We just keep it moving forward by talking to them regularly about it, more or less on a confidential basis so far. On the issue of safe consumption sites themselves, I think we've moved during the pandemic in quite a nimble manner as a city to make sure that in those shelters we had to set up for physical distancing reasons in hotels and so on, we actually brought harm reduction supports to people there, because that wasn't initially something we were doing, and it's not because we deliberately decided not to. It's just because we hadn't focused on how much of a need there was for that. I will tell you right now, I mean, and Councillor Wong-Tam knows this. I mean, I was involved in discussions this week about some plans we have with regard to different kinds of real estate, and when we look at even the possibility of moving the works, which is one of the single most most used safe consumption facilities in the city, it's not easy to find a new place to have those kinds of services, let alone expand the ones we have. Because when I say it's not easy, it's just not easy. I mean, real estate in the city is difficult to begin with, and then you get into all the other aspects of this. But we work away at this in consult with the councillors and with others and the community to make sure that we can try and continue to do the right thing and to push the other governments, frankly, to be our partners. It's more of a challenge with the provincial government in terms of their interest in these issues, but we're working away at that. On your first question, I will only say this to you. I have come to understand quite well the different experiences different communities have had. We're in this job as long as I have been, and you actually do go out and listen. I went out when we were doing our anti-Black racism consultations. We had 800 people involved in those public meetings, and I went to quite a few of them and actually listened to people talk about their experiences with the police. And I've been to many other places where that's happened, including with the 2S LGBTQ2 plus communities. And I will just say to you that I think there's a real effort being made there. I acknowledge and agree with what you said, that training, is of some help, but you also need to bring about cultural change. I think that is beginning to happen. I think some of the examples I gave you this morning are examples of things where the culture of the police service and finding other ways to deal with things so that the encounters that people do have in more vulnerable communities are with the right people. And that isn't always going to be the police. In fact, we've learned that. I will just say to you that while you have to be careful that you find a way to deal with this, so it doesn't become the case that there's 100 training programs being given to people. Myself, I have taken the anti-Black racism training for the city and the police, and I've taken, and when I say I've taken, I participated in the training for the Indigenous sort of sensitivity. And I told you, as I say, even at my advanced age, I've got lots of energy. I'm not that old, but I mean, I've learned out of those an extraordinary amount. I made about history and about points you don't focus on because your own background doesn't cause you to focus on points you should focus on, in terms of microaggressions and different kinds of things. And so I will just tell you that I think the notion of having what you talked about, which is this kind of trauma sensitized, real lived experience training, I think if you looked at the investment of time for public servants and for police officers and others, that actually is time really well spent. If I look at the degree to which I learned some things from a few hours of my time invested in those kinds of training programs, I think it is worth it. And so I will certainly take that as something that, that I hear you on that, and I appreciate the point you're making.
Thank you very much to you and to the mayor. Next person to speak, next member is Ranjit. And Ranjit, we should probably all give you a round of applause and congratulations on your recent honor. For those who don't know, Ranjit was just recently awarded the Pride Award from the City of Toronto. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Ranjit.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to also respond to the comments you made, or standing up to those who portray people with mental health and addictions and living in poverty as criminals. So poverty, I want to support you in that effort and add that poverty is not a crime. Criminals are those systems that push certain groups of people into poverty. So nobody willingly live without a home, without a house. And so they are the ones who are victimized by unjust, unequal systems. And we live in a history of, in a situation of that is which portrays inequality in such high proportions. During COVID pandemic, we saw the increase of inequality right in Canada and all over the world. While those who are living in poor and working 2-3 jobs are struggling so hard. And so it is the way to address the systems that minimize inequality that will take us collectively to a better society that I want to highlight. Also, the second thing is the economic cost of poverty. A lot of research has been done on the sheer economic cost of poverty. So maintaining this poverty and letting it happen, letting it increase is a huge economic cost and a burden in so many ways, to mental health, to policing, to all kinds of other things. So if we reverse that and look at the real economic cost of poverty, we can bring a fantastic economic argument to minimize, eradicate poverty, because that is what is necessary in so many ways. I want to highlight housing, the issue of housing during pandemic, especially for 2S LGBTQ plus people, and I work with LGBTQ plus refugees and newcomers, and especially for trans people and trans newcomers. Housing is a huge issue. Shelters are very, very unsafe, and I had to deal with a trans newcomer client over the weekend, and they were thrown out of their place of stay, and they had to stay out in the cold for 2 days, and got in touch with me. So we had to put up them in a private hotel for a day until we found them a safe place. So these are the realities, and I want to highlight the need for housing, especially when intersections of multiple marginalities come into play. For example, being trans, being new to Canada, being racialized, being Black, and so on. And the ripple effect of those compounds so badly, and that is where a lot of people are. And thank you.
Well, thank you for that comment. I will just tell you that during the pandemic, but even so, more so afterwards, we've been trying to become increasingly sensitive to that. And I've known all the way along, but fortunately, and I will say this, we had the help of the federal government in inventing something called the Rapid Housing Program. And it was a brilliant masterstroke, and it's helped us a lot, in that what they essentially did was gave us money and said, you can use this money to buy, to build supportive housing on either your own land or somewhere else. And we've actually bought a couple of, as Councillor Wong-Tam knows, a couple of fairly large buildings, pardon me, that's allowed us in a relatively short period of time during the pandemic. And I think it came about kind of as a result of the pandemic, but also because of this broader problem of people with different issues in their lives needing, first and foremost, maybe even before a job, because they wouldn't be in a position to have a job until they could have a stable, supported environment in which they could live. And then from there, you can look for other even more permanent housing, and in particular for a job. And we have put in place now, and we will have by the end of the year, they called it the Rapid Housing Program because the condition they placed on giving us all this money, hundreds of millions of dollars in Toronto, was that we had to have that housing available to people with these needs for the supports within a matter of a year. And so it actually means that in some cases, and I could name you the different projects, and that's where I said I've had to go to neighborhood by neighborhood by neighborhood to defend these, because they've been criticized by some people who didn't want them in their neighborhood. They were of course all in favor of having supportive housing, but just not exactly where we decided to locate it. But I'm so proud when I've gone to these places. I'm proud of the city that we have places that for many people represent the first time in a long time they've had a home. These are small apartments, but they're self-contained apartments. They are a home. And they have supports in them, mental health supports, substance use issue supports, a job and housing supports. And, I do think it represents scaled up. And one of the representations I made to the Minister of Housing, who I met with this week federally, is that we need to have another phase of that, with the money almost being doubled, so that we can do even more of this, because I think it represents a big part of the answer for chronic homelessness, is that we can put people into supportive housing. We have a challenge with the provincial government, to be candid, in that they are the ones that pay for the operating expenses for the professional supporters, the medical and other people. And their commitment is less certain to us in terms of providing for that money. This year, that'll be like in the order of like $50 million. It's not an inconsiderable sum, and the municipal government just can't sustain those things, nor should they. It's part of the healthcare system and part of social services financed by all of the revenue sources they have with income taxes and sales taxes and things we don't have. So I agree with you at the root of this. And that's why I mentioned at the end of my remarks as well, the notion of getting a job. Because look, I know this sounds like a notion you hear pushed at you by, sometimes people you'd consider to be, really conservative politicians. I consider myself to be sort of a centrist and just a pragmatist. But the fact is, if people can have a stable job and they can have a proper opportunity, no matter who they are, because we have all kinds of people from different backgrounds that have come through the education system and have the tools and the ambition, the ability, but they have an obstruction in their way, historical or otherwise. If they can get a secure job, that can be the foundation from which you can address a lot of other things, or stop people from, falling into a place where they need more support. So I just entirely agree with what you're saying, and we're trying very hard to do things that address that, including with, and it's one of the reasons I asked you as a committee for your advice with respect to economic opportunity and jobs in the economy as we come into a recovery period. What can we do to help people in these communities, particularly, to access opportunity on a more equitable basis and take part in what I believe will be a new boom for Toronto? I really believe that. I think we're going to boom again because we just have too much going for us here, but there are people who are left behind.
Thank you so much for that. Really great comments here, and excellent feedback from the mayor. Lori Ross, and then Susan Gapka. And before we sort of close off the speakers list, anybody else before we do that? No? Okay, Terrence, okay, great. So Lori, you go next, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Tory, for taking the time to be here with us today. I do not share your enthusiasm for increasing police budget as a way to support our communities, but I am enthusiastic about the non-police crisis response team. And I'm wondering if you know how those workers will be prepared to work with QS LGBTQ+ people and with other communities that intersect with our communities who also experience discrimination in the healthcare and other systems. Thank you.
Well, it's a really good question, and I would be happy to get us into discussing the police budget, but I think that's probably for another day in terms of the increase and whatnot. But I will say that the important thing, I think, is that we're moving to do things like this community crisis response. And I will only say to you that one of the key things in preparing to do it, it's why I was saying earlier on that it's better we should do this in the 4 large areas that are of greatest need, so that we can develop that sensitivity early on. And then when we take it citywide, which is the plan to do it by 2025, we will have developed the relationships and the sensitivity to make sure that each community that is represented among the 30,000 people that we get calls from that are in distress can be handled with a degree of sensitivity and professionalism. And I will only say to you, if you look at who the people are that we've picked, because we're running this program very much with partners that are established community health organizations. And going from memory, it's Taibu up in the northeast of the city, which will obviously has a huge wealth of experience with respect to, in particular, although not limited to this, the Black, specific needs of the Black communities in mental health. Downtown, it's an Indigenous organization, the name of which I just forget, to be honest. But we're trying, even by the choice of the agencies that are going to be our partners in delivering this, to start from the beginning to make sure that we have people that are sensitized. And I think they will bring with them not just a sensitivity about the community they may be most experienced in serving, like Taibu, but they will bring an understanding of the need to address what you said. And so I can't speak, to be honest, Laurie, specifically to what has been done to make sure it's sensitive, but you can be sure, having listened to you now, just ask the question, I'll go back and ask, because it is, it's a very important question, because I don't know the breakdown, but a good number, I would assume, a number that makes it a meaningful question of the persons in distress calls that are received are going to come from these communities that are represented here today. And there should be an answer to that question. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to find out, and we'll make sure we get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Mayor. The organization name that you're looking for is Two-Spirited Peoples of the First Nation.
I'm sorry.
And,
Sorry, I didn't know the name. I can't remember all these things.
Absolutely, but I know that many of the members on the committee will be very familiar with the work of that community-based organization.
And Councillor, if I can, because Laura raised this earlier on, and I think it was Laura, I have sat down, again, as part of my own education. It's the only reason I sat down probably now with 20 Indigenous serving organizations in the city, and it was just a session where I said, please tell me what you do, and please tell me how we're standing in the way of you doing it better, and please tell me. And I think they would tell you, they operate under this task umbrella. They would tell you that the direct result of that, and I'm proud, again, that with the council's full support, we have led, for example, in applying 20% of the Rapid Housing Action Phase 2 money. We're talking like millions, tens and tens of millions of dollars, to the biggest push for Indigenous housing ever done in the history of the city. Thousands of units, because the biggest group represented among the homeless population, people experiencing homelessness, are Indigenous people. And so we're actually acting, but I picked up the need for that and the lack of partnership with Indigenous housing from sitting in these meetings, just like this group right here. I heard it. They told me this, and I went and looked. I said, do we have any partnerships? And they said, well, not really. And we now are going to be having a huge partnership with a huge amount of money, because that's really what counts. You all know you can talk about this stuff, but if you don't allocate the money, it doesn't accomplish much. But I just wanted to mention that, because it's how I learned. Next question.
Fantastic. Thank you. Laurie, did you have a follow-up, or was that the end of your question? Okay. Thank you, Laurie. Susan Gapka, and then Terrence Rodriguez.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Gapka. I use she, her pronouns, and want to encourage other people to use pronouns, educational opportunities for trans and non-binary people. I've adapted. Thank you for being here, Mayor Tory. I was at the city executive meeting to just promote and confirm that the important work of this committee. You might know that in the early 2000s, this committee was struck, and then I guess terminated would be the word. And that's where we created the Pride Award. And so there you go. We looked around the room, and we also did marriage equality or same-sex marriage at the time. So just want to confirm how important that this committee is, that we have a chance to review city policies, the leadership of Kristen Wong-Tam and Councillor Wong-Tam and Ainsley in helping us put a spotlight on some of our issues. I've got a number of points here. I think I just want to highlight something around, you mentioned the Police Services Board. Cycling last night, I've never been so happy to see so many road closures. And so well done, Toronto Police Services. Even though I had to navigate a few, what was a road closure was a detour for someone like me, but just that, seeing that was important. I also want to highlight something, and I am actually missing a mental health and advisory panel meeting with the Toronto Police Services Board as we speak, helping work through all the logistics of these pilot programs and the mobile crisis intervention teams, which was unanimously supported at City Executive. And I think the biggest comment was not fast enough, but well done, city staff. Another issue with the Toronto Police Service that I'd like to see come back to this committee, and I hoped I would be less time, but here we go, is the Gender Diversity and Trans Inclusion Initiative, which is moving forward. So, and that is really around the police must do better on how they work, how they detain and work with trans communities. So just wanted to highlight that and thank you for your support on that at the Police Services Board. On economic opportunity, trans people, as you mentioned, are significantly marginalized, more educated than the general population in some instances, but in poverty levels of income security. So yes, let's work on that. Where we can do some work is around inclusion of the social determinants of health, and that comes around housing. And on September 27th, we moved a resolution, and I'm just going to bring it up. And this is the hard question, Honorable Mayor, that we would request the city to oppose the excessive armed police presence in the clearing of encampments in the context of the city's homeless and housing first initiatives, solutions. So my question here today is, what is happening with that recommendation from this committee? Because we haven't heard back yet from that. So yeah, thank you for being here, working with us, and your commitment to this committee. And over to you, Mayor.
Well, Susan, you raised many issues, and I thank you because you are a consistent advocate. I should say, by the way, because he's not on the screen in front of me, but I heard Councillor Wong-Tam mention he was here. Paul Ainsley, as a councillor as well, has been a very consistent. I mean, I would say aside from Councillor Wong-Tam, there is no one I hear from more frequently just on things that come up that affect the 2S LGBTQ 2S communities than Paul Ainsley, and he's deeply personally committed to this, and I really appreciate that. And I just had forgotten until you mentioned that he was here because I don't see him in front of me in the group that I see on my screen. I'll just deal with the last issue because you raised many, and Susan and I had lots of chance to talk to you, and it's not that I diminish any of those other issues, a bit of which we've spoken about. Again, I will say to you that you learn every day, and there are things that you will find with me that if I believe in my heart that we ended up doing the right thing, and I don't control exactly how they unfold, but when I say we also have learned subsequent to some of the events that you're making reference to in terms of the clearing of the encampments. But the one thing that I've been very clear on, and I will continue to be clear on this, and you're not going to change my mind in the context of it's not meant to lack any kind of a lack of sympathy. In fact, I would have said that the patience and the determination and the compassion and the professionalism that was exhibited by city staff in going time after time, you heard me refer to this number of 20,000 visits to people who were experiencing homelessness in encampments, was something that to me I was mindful of that effort was being made by a very dedicated and professional outreach staff that we have at the city. There did come a time with some of these encampments where, to be quite frank, and this is a view I've stated publicly, so I'm stating it here, and I know it won't be music to the ears of a number of you, there were instances in some of those parks where there were large numbers of vacant tents, and when we asked, well, could those at least be taken down so that we could reduce the footprint of these encampments, I was getting pressure from councillors, from local residents, because the parks are for the use of everybody. And some of the people who in many cases were not the people experiencing homelessness themselves just said, no, we're not taking those down, they're staying here. And they in some cases, I'm telling you the truth, that they actually resisted efforts that the city made to go and be in touch on a continuous basis with the people experiencing homelessness to provide them with an indoor space. And so there came a time when we simply couldn't accept the fact, when there were alternatives being presented, a variety of them, the parks being indefinitely resided in by people in these encampments. Now, after those incidents, and believe me, there's all kinds of reviews going on of exactly what happened in those instances, and I won't get into all that in terms of who did what and who didn't do what. I will say to you, we adopted a slightly different approach in a couple of other parks, and I'm very pleased to tell you, and this is where you learn. I'm just a human being like all of you, and I learn every day, and we adopted a different approach, and I'm pleased to tell you, we completely eliminated a couple of encampments. Now, of course, it helps that the weather changes and people are in need of being indoors more and so on. But I will just tell you that we adopted a different kind of approach in terms of how we approach people, the partnerships we formed with community agencies and so on. And we we really made great progress, and I learned from that. And so I will just say to you that I don't direct, what the police do. I do have to speak up with respect to parks and what parks are to be used for from the standpoint of both the safety of the people experiencing homelessness, their health, and the law. And I do that. And some of you will disagree with that, but that's why we have elected governments and why we have elections. And so, and I'm not saying that in any arrogant way. I'm just saying I do what I think is right for the whole of the population that I have to represent, which is 3 million people. So I have learned from that, and we have used successfully some different ways of trying to make sure that what we do in the end is what we want to do. In the end, we don't want to clear out parks, quote unquote. What we want to do is house the homeless. That's what we want to do. That's why I fought so hard and showed up at every public meeting without exception to support these supportive housing buildings, because I know that represents more of the answer than anything else. If we can give people experiencing homelessness a home with supports like that, we will. I think 99 out of 100, if not 99,000 out of 100, will want to live in one of those places as opposed to living in a tent in a park. Very few people want to live in a tent in a park, especially in our climate and so forth, or regardless of that. So, Susan, that's the best I can respond for today, we'll talk about it again, I'm sure.
Thank you very much, Mayor, and thank you, Susan, for your questions. Terrence, you're our last speaker, and Councillor Ainsley, welcome back to the meeting. I don't know if you've heard, but the Mayor was giving you a big shout out, and I just wanted to make sure you knew that that took place, but also we would all echo the Mayor's sentiments about how what a big champion you are.
I did. Thank you. And thank you, Mayor Tory. I didn't want to interrupt, and I had my video off. Thank you very much. And I appreciate you being here this morning and all the support for our committee and also the community.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you,
okay. So Terrence, you're our last speaker and questioner. And then after that, we are going to have to probably move along. We've got a few items on the agenda to get through. Okay, Terrence, go ahead, please.
Hello, good morning. Terrence, he, him pronouns. Good to see you again, Mayor. So there was 2 points that I wanted to bring up. One was in response to your ask about, employment and how to create more opportunities. And I speak to the lens because I'm from the North Etobicoke area. I don't know if you recognize some like the COVID engagement stuff, but I work out in Rexdale. And I work a lot with the 2S LGBTQ community, more specifically with the youth. And employment is a big issue for the youth in that area. It is very, very hard to find jobs that are safe and inclusive. One, whether they're even given the jobs because employers have biases, or two, even if the work environment is safe. That's a big thing. One of the major employers that I found in Rexdale that has been supportive to the community has been a Starbucks that opened up around Finch and Highway 27. And I had been meeting with the manager talking about how she's been trying to support her employees as they have been facing discrimination while working at Starbucks. They've had coffees thrown in their faces. They've had people yelling at them. And so this is a major issue in this particular area of the neighborhood. And I know we talk a lot about the city, but don't forget the suburbs. I'm going to keep pushing that. So talking about employment opportunities, if you can look in these suburbs and connect with employers to help them create an environment that is inclusive to the community, and two, offer these opportunities to the community when they're looking for these jobs. And I know it's already happening. There's a boom looking for work. There's a lot of employment opportunities going out there. But just because they exist doesn't mean they're accessible or safe for the community. And that's a major thing for us. So that's one word of advice on how to address something like that. The other thing is bring up again, like those shelters and housing. And again, speaking from the lens of the area that I work in, we only have one shelter for youth in Rexdale, and that's Youth Without Shelter. And it's a great shelter, but it's also very limited in capacity. And I'll tell you from my program, the majority of the youth in my program, I've sent to that shelter or have to send to other ones because they're full. Most of my youth are kicked out or they have to leave home. And so the limited resources in Rexdale for the community and housing for us has been extremely challenging because you have youth in a moment in their life where they're displaced, where they're dealing with trauma and these experiences with their families or in their homes or relationships in general. And then it's compounded by having to be displaced from their community where they have their safety and their security and their supports. Like I've through the pandemic had to follow a bunch of my youth who have been rotating from shelter to shelter to like these hotel shelters that were so traumatic for some of them. One of my youth ended up getting into a traumatized, like, catatonic state and had to be hospitalized. There's been so many issues going on with shelter when it comes to this community. And so if you can look into some kind of investment, I know you're already doing, and we got Sprout House, we got Friends of Ruby, you know, there's some stuff, but it's primarily downtown. Hit up again, like I said, the suburbs where there is also support for the community up in those areas, because we are there. And you'll find actually a lot of the community up there, especially people of color and newcomers. So having that additional housing support in those areas would be great.
Terrence, thank you. And Councillor, I'm with apologies going to have to answer this relatively briefly, and would that my previous answer should have been briefer, but I have to go off to something I'm expected to speak on at 10:30. But Terrence, first of all, I will take away the idea that maybe, you know, in this case, yes, there's a need for public sector training, if you want to call it that, to do with sensitivity to some of these issues, but maybe we should be, maybe with your advice, looking to reach out to the private sector and to talk about some of these issues, because, you know, oftentimes we talk about things, people being sort of sensitized inside the government, but outside the government is the bigger world of employment and opportunity than here. And I think there may be something we could do there to kind of sort of, again, those training programs that I had brought to my attention, any person in the private sector hearing the stuff I heard in the anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous or the Indigenous training, were things that were self-evident when you heard them, but somebody needed to say them and say, oh yeah, okay, that's a good point, we should change that. So I will take that under advisement, because I think your point is extremely well taken as it regards the LGBTQ2S plus communities. And on the suburbs part, good point. I mean, Paul will tell you, Councillor Ainsley, that we have to always remind ourselves of that. There aren't just these issues and obstacles and challenges facing people downtown. There are often more concentrations of people downtown because the supports are there. You know, whereas they would rather live in Rexdale and Scarborough because that's home for them instead of coming downtown. And so if we've done this with a lot of things, you know, where we're starting to recognize that fact. And so I'm glad you raised it, and I will be asking about it as soon as I'm finished. We'll finish the thing I have to do right now, but this morning I'm going to ask about that, because I'm unaware of exactly what the balance is as between downtown and suburban. And it's a big city, and we have to make sure that people can get their supports close to home, because that's where they have their other supports, you know, beyond just a safe place to live. Councillor, with your forgiveness, I'm going to just exit and thank the members very much for those excellent questions. And I've tried to answer them. I am an ally. I mean, you know, I know there'll be days you'll be unhappy with me, and that's the way it goes in positions of leadership. You're all probably facing that in your own jobs. There are people who disagree with you sometimes, but my heart is in the right place. And I look forward to working with Paul and Kristen and all the others to make sure that we carry on with trying to make progress on this stuff. And that's all you got to make sure you're moving forward every day. Sometimes it's always never fast enough, but we're trying to speed some of these things up. So I thank you so much for your input this morning and for inviting me to come.
Thank you very much, Mayor, and we welcome you back at any given time.
I'll come back for sure, anytime you ask me. Thank you very much.
Okay,
bye now.
Take care. Okay, so that was great, everyone, and I'm sorry that we did end up eating a little bit of time in our agenda. We've got a few items that we do have to go through, and I know that they're very important. Can I please have someone move to receive the mayor's presentation? Okay, Terrence, I saw your hand go up first. Thank you. All those in agreement? Any contrary minded? That is approved. Thank you. The next item is the chair's report. I apologize I wasn't able to table in time to get it onto the printed agenda, but I can give you some quick summary notes. There were two motions that our committee sent along and recommendations that were then ultimately adopted by the executive committee. One was a preliminary service plan for transgender and non-binary youth. That was adopted without any further amendments, debate, or recommendations. And of course, the actions to respond to the drug poisoning crisis in the City of Toronto. And that was the title that the mayor was searching for. And so the executive committee has adopted our recommendations again without any amendments. Just a quick update on the cultural districts. Many of you have been following the work of economic development staff. They were here with the presentation. We've had them in on 2 occasions, and they're going to continue to do consultation with the community. The intention is to try to find ways to create new financial incentives and policy tools, of course, to protect and preserve 2S LGBT businesses across the city and in the village. The immediate next step is that the staff have made some commitments to further develop outreach, educational awareness regarding the need to retain and grow those businesses, largely because they are also in many ways the producer and the makers of our cultural space. So it's not always going to fit neat and tidy in a museum or a gallery. Our cultural spaces oftentimes are self-created. And I think that staff, city staff who are in charge of that program are starting to really understand that. We do have a presentation on 2022 budget coming forward very shortly, so I'll keep my remarks extremely brief. I did want to highlight that the 519 Community Center, of course, which is the iconic LGBT community center of our city, is also growing and pivoting their program in a couple of unique ways. During the pandemic, they really have been stretching themselves to try to deliver a range of services that they hadn't before, including public awareness campaign delivery around vaccine importance and its role in the fight against COVID-19. Not very easy work, oftentimes reaching the most difficult to reach marginalized population, but certainly they have been on the ground and coordinating the downtown east response, which we're really grateful for because that was not something that they originally had on their work plan, but they did pivot. The other thing is that there's a few budget requests with the 519 I wanted to flag for you that is going to be talking about building additional supports for the health and well-being of the community that is within the Church and Wellesley sort of catchment area. I thought that would be of interest because we have seen a lot of budgets for our agencies and community centers largely frozen. Not too many agencies or organizations are getting enhanced or further budget additions, but we are going to, myself and a few other councillors are going to do everything we can to give the 519 the tools that they need, the financial tools that they need in order for them to continue to do what is now an expanded role for them. And then finally, I did have a motion at City Council, which was adopted, and I'm very proud, but the motion was entitled Making Space for the Arts. What we learned is that the traditional grant streams, oftentimes delivered by the Toronto Arts Council, wasn't always reaching the new type of sort of single makers, and I'm going to describe it. These would be individuals in our community that was creating LGBT pop-up spaces, art spaces, sort of congregation spaces. And because they were technically for profit, even though it's questionable whether or not they actually generated any profit, they did still provide very valuable opportunities for the community to come together. And that was made more difficult by the pandemic. So the request of City Council, which was adopted, was to have City Council explore the feasibility of creating a very new grant stream that would actually allow for more dynamic funding of both nonprofit and quote unquote for-profit LGBT space makers. And this would include creating opportunities for pop-up animation in storefronts and looking at ways to support agencies that are producing art space and helping them scale up. I'm sure many of you have also read in the papers and on social media that we've been seeing a lot of arts organizations struggle. The past 2 years has been difficult. So this was just an urgent request to see if we can actually do more and do it quickly. And that is the end of my chair's budget, the chair's presentation. It will be tabled, so you'll have it online. It's much more eloquently written than I've just summarized it, but you'll have it. You'll get a chance to read it shortly. Anyone of questions for the chair's report? To the chair's report? No. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. And then anyone to move the chair's report to receive? Thank you, Jennifer. I see your hand. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Okay, great. Okay, so we've got 2 items and they're both very substantial left on the agenda. And the item that we're going to be discussing is the 2022 budget, the city's budget. Today, we are going to welcome the Executive Director of Financial Planning. He is here to give us a presentation. Mr. Stephen Conforti, please go ahead. You have the floor when you're ready.
Thank you so much. Good morning. Before I start, I'd like to thank Councillor Wong-Tam and the committee members for inviting me to present on the 2022 budget and for your interest and participation in the city's budget process. My name is Steve Conforti, pronouns he and him, and I'm the Executive Director of Financial Planning at the City of Toronto, responsible for leading the development of the city's $15 billion operating budget and $47 billion 10-year capital plan. Next slide, please. So 2022 is again a challenging budget that continues to respond to the pandemic and build the foundation for recovery and prosperity for all. The impacts of the pandemic is profound, ongoing, and evolving. In 2021, the city stayed strong against great challenges, maintaining essential services and investing in community and virtual services that are the foundation for Toronto's recovery. The 2022 budget, like last year's, is a COVID budget. The budget also recognizes that COVID-19 exacerbates historical inequities for Toronto's Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving communities, including 2SLGBTQ+ communities, which must guide our decisions and actions. A whole-of-government and whole-of-community approach will support a successful and sustainable long-term recovery. The fiscal challenges we face will continue in 2022 and beyond, requiring ongoing commitments from all orders of government. Recovery must consider social, climate, and economic outcomes to achieve prosperity for all. Next slide, please. The city's fiscal sustainability was challenging before the pandemic. The situation has been exacerbated and will continue to be challenging through 2022 and future years. 2022 budget sets the foundation for long-term recovery, adjusted for impacts of COVID-19 with $1.4 billion in expected financial impacts in the form of reduced revenues, increased public health response costs, increased costs related to continued delivery of city services while adhering to public health guidelines. The city's fiscal pressures will continue to be difficult in 2023 and beyond. Continued support is critical. Next slide. Although this is our third year experiencing financial challenges due to COVID-19, we've continued to make significant progress over this term of council. We've continued to institute best practices to inform our financial decisions. We're very proud of the progress made in establishing outcomes-based budgets with focus on accountability and establishing trust and confidence with council and the public. The city applies equity, including intersectionality, as well as climate lenses in our budget process. We have worked with the GTHA and Big Six cities in unprecedented ways. We're collectively coming up with solutions to problems. We're aligning our COVID reporting to ensure other governments have a holistic understanding of municipal impacts. And we have a renewed regional strategy to tackle shared issues, which is so important during these challenging times. Our capital spend rates have continued to improve, and our annual capital investment of $3.1 billion is vitally important in support of the economy through investments and job growth for Toronto, Ontario, and Canada. Our capital plan continues to grow with prudent investments to fund key city priorities, including housing and climate. Throughout COVID-19, credit rating agencies have maintained Toronto's stable credit rating, noting that the city's cohesive council approach and prudent policy and fiscal management have preserved our credit rating through this crisis. Next slide. The 2022 operating budget totals just under $15 billion, including the rate-supported budgets that were approved in December. Our 10-year capital plan totals just over $46 billion, with $16 billion from our rate-supported budgets, again approved in December. Next slide. And next slide again, please. So as we do every year, we establish a set of guiding principles to prepare a staff-recommended budget while ensuring the budget is balanced as legislatively required. Our first principle is to manage COVID-19 impacts and ensure the path for recovery is established. Our second principle is to preserve existing services consistent with public health guidelines and legislative requirements. Third, we've prepared a budget that promotes tax affordability for residents and businesses, reflecting an inflationary tax increase. This is particularly important given the impacts and uncertainties people have experienced due to COVID-19. Finally, we are focused on building a prosperous Toronto for all, with emphasis on equity and reconciliation, climate action, and health and well-being. The city takes an intersectional approach to embedding and advancing equity and reconciliation throughout the budget process. The pandemic has emphasized the need to continue investments in prosperity and has highlighted the social and health inequities that exist amongst Torontonians. In order to advance prosperity for all, the City of Toronto must deliver services with fair and equitable outcomes for all residents and businesses. In addition, Toronto's climate action initiatives reflect the climate change emergency and our commitment to achieving the city's net zero goals. And finally, we're committed to Toronto's neighborhoods and communities being safe, healthy, livable, and vibrant for residents and businesses now and into the future. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the 2022 staff recommended operating budget totals nearly $15 billion. In December, Council approved the rate-supported operating budgets of just under $2 billion for Toronto Water, Solid Waste, and Parking Authority. So today I'll focus on the tax-supported portion of our budget, which is just over $13 billion. Next slide. As reflected in our guiding principles, we're committed to preserving existing service levels while adhering to public health guidelines. We're keeping taxes affordable with an inflationary residential property tax increase of 2.9%, reflective of the 12-month average in Toronto. The COVID financial impacts remain significant. The 2022 budget requires $1.4 billion through continued partnerships with the federal and provincial government to ensure we can continue to respond to the pandemic. The 2022 budget supports economic recovery and includes a 15% property tax rate reduction for small businesses. Our 2022 budget enhances social recovery with a total of $135 million of new and enhanced investments to build a prosperous Toronto focused on equity and reconciliation, modernization, and a safe and livable city. Next slide, please. This slide captures 8 years of historical operating budget pressures driven by inflation and growth and demand in city services. You can see the impacts COVID-19 has had on the city finances over the last 3 years. Going into 2022, we were already facing inflationary and growth-related pressures of $583 million. With COVID-19 impacts, that operating pressure was increased to $2 billion. We continue to work internally to manage and mitigate as much of the city's pressure as we can. Since the onset of the pandemic, the city has implemented mitigation measures, offsets, and spending restraints equal to $1.6 billion to address pressures and support the continuance of service delivery. Next slide. While I'm proud of the significant mitigation efforts of the city, the COVID challenges are too great for us to address on our own. We need continued support from our federal and provincial partners. Ongoing support in response to COVID-19 is critical to ensure our services continue in 2022. We require $1.4 billion in funding supports from other orders of government. COVID-19 has had significant operating impacts in many of our services delivered by city divisions and agencies. We continue to feel the impacts of COVID-19 on our transit system, where reduced ridership has resulted in significant revenue losses, but it's essential that we keep our buses and subways going. We have implemented physical distancing measures in our shelters in adherence with provincial public health guidelines. COVID-19 has impacted our corporate revenues with reduced dividends from Toronto Parking Authority and Toronto Hydro and reduced municipal accommodation tax. And of course, we're seeing increased public health care costs in response to COVID-19 in support of provincial health goals. While we require COVID funding to support our 2022 operating budget, these investments by the provincial and federal government also benefit the economy for the entire GTA region, the province, and the country. In addition to COVID-19 funding, the city expects it will continue to be supported by the Government of Canada for refugee response costs of up to $61 million now that the Canadian borders have reopened, and by the Province of Ontario for costs of $27 million for the continuation of supported housing initiatives they committed to in 2021. Next slide, please. So this slide demonstrates both how our budget is funded and where we make investments with those funds. In terms of how our budget is funded, $4.65 billion or 35% comes from property tax revenue. The second largest source of funding is federal and provincial revenue. Of this $4 billion amount, $1.4 billion represents required funding as a result of COVID-19. $88 million reflects refugee response and continued support of housing supports. And the remainder of about $2.4 billion is for cost-shared programs. Land transfer tax is being budgeted at $950 million, of which $150 million is funding towards our capital plan. You'll notice that the majority of our remaining funding sources reflect a loss from prior years due to the impacts of COVID-19. In terms of where does our money go, $3.8 billion is spent on our cost-shared social programs, such as Toronto Employment and Social Services, Children's Services, long-term care homes, and public health. $2.2 billion will be spent on the TTC. Even though the fare box does not cover the same proportion of expenses as pre-COVID times, we understand how important it is to continue to deliver transit services. Pre-pandemic, the fare box covered about 2/3 of operating expenses, whereas today the fare box covers about 1/3 of total operating costs. $2.1 billion is spent on emergency services. This includes fire, paramedics, and police. $1.1 billion in corporate and capital financing costs, reflecting funding to build and maintain the city's infrastructure. And the remaining $3.9 billion funds all other city programs and agencies. Next slide, please. So I just highlighted the significant portion of the city's budget goes towards cost-shared programs with other orders of government. On an annual and ongoing basis, the City of Toronto invests in extensions of federal and provincial responsibilities. Approximately 23%, or $1.1 billion of Toronto's annual property taxes are directly invested in three key themes to build a prosperous Toronto for all. We're proud that we're able to support these three areas of housing, social and community programs, and healthcare, and from direct contributions from our tax base, not to mention the significant capital investments also made in these areas. These may be areas where Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving groups, including diverse 2S LGBTQ+ communities, face barriers to accessing and utilizing services. As such, these investments may support improvements in access and sustainment of these services. Next slide, please. Even though this is again a COVID budget, we're making prudent investments to ensure we are well positioned to recover and build from COVID-19. New and enhanced investments totaling $135 million reflect a combination of cost-shared programs with the federal and provincial government and direct city spending. Our new and enhanced investments are above and beyond the ongoing preservation of services and service levels maintained in the operating budget and significant capital investments in areas of housing and climate. All are focused on laying the foundation for social and economic recovery for Toronto, the region, and the country. They will enhance social and equity initiatives, ensure a safe and livable city for all, and will assist in modernizing our services. For example, we're investing $8.6 million for long-term care reform, which fulfills Council's commitment and responds to provincial legislation for increased individual care. We're investing $5.8 billion in reconciliation and combating anti-Black racism, including adding resources to deliver the city's first reconciliation action plan, providing startup costs for the Indigenous Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and for the Black Food Sovereignty Program. Concerted and specific investments are being made to support Indigenous and Black communities to advance reconciliation, equity, and justice. These investments recognize the distinct and specific experiences of these groups and works to address the disproportionate barriers facing them as a result of historic and ongoing structural inequities. Advancing reconciliation and addressing anti-Black racism supports the diverse communities within these groups facing multiple layers of marginalization, including members who may identify as 2S LGBTQ+. We are also ensuring Toronto is a safe and livable city through enhanced investments of $12.5 million in community safety, including implementation of year 3 of the Paramedic Services multi-year staffing plan. And we're focused on information security with investments of $17.9 million, which is so important in our increasingly digital world. Next slide, please. Within the 2022 staff recommended budget, several investments directly address or intersect with the key priority areas that the 2S LGBTQ+ Advisory Committee are focused on, specifically housing, shelter, community safety, and poverty reduction. The budget includes a suite of investments to improve supports for those facing homelessness and improve access to housing and shelters. Examples include an investment to expand the eviction prevention in this community program, or EPIC, that will enhance staffing capacity to respond to the demand and need for eviction prevention services. An investment in expansion of the senior services unit to ensure sufficient staffing levels to implement all initiatives in the expanded mandate related to municipal service planning and oversight of senior housing to approximately 15,000 low-income senior tenants. The city recognizes the important work already happening in communities to address gaps and inequities. The city is investing directly to amplify and support communities in their ongoing leadership and work to address these inequities. An example includes the Little Jamaica Cultural District Master Plan, in response to the community's desire to protect and enhance the African, Black, and Caribbean cultures and businesses along Eglinton Avenue West. It's also part of the City of Toronto's commitment to confronting anti-Black racism and supporting Black communities to grow in place and address barriers, including those that identify as 2S LGBTQ+ community members. There's also funding to implement the Community Crisis Support Services pilots, which you'll hear more about this work in the SafeTO presentation next on the agenda. The city proposes new and enhanced investments to support 2019 to 2022 Poverty Reduction Strategy Action Plan, Examples include children's services funded through the Child Care and Early Year Workforce Funding Agreement to support the retention and recruitment of a high-quality child care and early years workforce. This investment will facilitate children's services to embed an anti-oppressive and anti-racist lens to early childhood education, improve the inclusiveness of early years programs, and support the recruitment, retention, and professional development of a diverse and inclusive child care and early years workforce. Toronto Employment and Social Services is investing in family tuition benefits, which will include access to academic and tutoring supports targeted at youth aged 14 to 17 from low-income families in order to address challenges and learning losses that result from the transition to online school through the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, I wanted to highlight highlight 4 of the approximately 27 briefing notes shared with the public during the 2022 budget process. These 4 briefing notes, and the links are available here in the presentation, provide additional information on the topics of poverty reduction, equity impacts, and funding levels over time for SDF&A and also housing-related budgets that may be of interest to this committee. Next slide, please. As we look beyond 2022, there is sufficient uncertainty surrounding the city's COVID-19 response requirements, impacts to services as a result of public health measures, and the extent of federal and provincial funding support. We're currently forecasting potential pressures and demands on the city's operating budget in 2023 from $1.2 billion to $1.7 billion. We'll require to work with the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario to determine necessary funding supports to address these unprecedented pressures that continue to face the city. Next slide, please. And again. So the 2022 staff recommended operating budget promotes tax affordability for residents and businesses. The inflationary residential tax rate increase of 2.9% is based on a 12-month average for Toronto. This translates to an increase of $93 for the average home. There's no increase in multi-residential properties in compliance with the provincial regulations. And consistent with policy and provincial regulations, the commercial and industrial rate increases are a fraction of the residential rate, with commercial half of the residential increase and industrial a third. And new for 2022, we're implementing a small business property tax subclass with a 15% property tax rate reduction, which is expected to benefit over 25,000 small businesses. Next slide, please. So as approved in 2019, there is also an incremental increase in the city building fund of 1.5%. This levy specifically dedicated to investing in transit and housing also leverages $7.2 billion in total funding. And this represents $48 tax increase to the average home. Next slide, please. So the average home in Toronto in 2022 has an assessed value of just over $697,000. The valuation for the current property assessment took place in 2016. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Ontario government has postponed the next reassessment. So this slide shows where your property tax investments are going. For the average home, the property tax bill will be $3,339. The majority is dedicated to keeping Toronto moving and keeping it safe and livable. 28% is invested in emergency services, 18% in transit and transportation, and 14% in cost-shared programs. Next slide. So moving to the capital budget, the staff recommended 10-year capital budget and plan will guide decisions on what investments will be made towards the acquisition, development, and repair or replacement of city infrastructure. And consistent with the operating budget, the development of the capital plan was guided by 4 key principles. The first being that the capital plan continues and builds upon investments committed to as part of past budget processes, which include significant increases in stated good repair funding for transit and housing, as well as other capital priorities. The budget was also developed with a climate focus, and I'll speak to that a bit later. Our partnership with the Government of Canada and Province of Ontario is vital to fund city programs and services that are supported by our capital assets and infrastructure. We continue to focus on developing a capital plan that is both achievable and affordable. This focus builds on actions that began as part of the 2022 process, and as a result, we continue to see improved capital spend rates even with the challenges presented by the pandemic. And lastly, the city continues its capital modernization efforts with key focuses over the next year towards the continued development of our capital asset management plan. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the tax-supported 10-year capital plan totals $30.5 billion, with $3.1 billion planned in 2022 alone. The budget continues to build on the success achieved as part of recent budget processes, in large part due to the planned continued 1.5% increase to the City Building Fund. Through the City Building Fund, we continue to support $6.4 billion in funding for critical capital investments in transit and housing, in addition to $800 million that's already been funded or committed to over the last 2 years. We have continued to grow our capital program with added investments in key priorities of mobility, housing, and modernization. And while these are our critical capital priorities, the budget was developed with an overarching priority towards investing in statehood repair needs, as well as an enhanced focus on how we can leverage our capital investments to support our climate goals. The capital plan continues to leverage and incorporate federal and provincial funding that totals $4.9 billion over 10 years, predominantly supporting housing and mobility investments. We continue to grow our capital program, and at the same time, we remain committed to improving capital spend rates. We ensure that our projects are budgeted when they're construction ready and that available funding is allocated to both where and when it can be spent. The growth and success of our capital program not only supports our infrastructure needs, but it's important to the success of the cities, provinces, and country's economy. It's estimated that we create roughly 9 jobs for every $1 million in capital spending. And again, we plan to spend $3.1 billion in the 2022 budget. Lastly, the capital plan is balanced and affordable. We've maintained our debt service ratio under 15% for all years within our 10-year planning period. And maintaining our debt service ratio has also ensured that we continue to receive positive credit ratings. We have continued to experience success in issuing both social and green bonds to finance our capital infrastructure. We've been a leader in this area and have now issued $780 million in green bonds and $200 million in social bonds, and plan to continue to issue both in 2022. So while I'm talking about capital, it's important to note that support from the Government of Canada and Province of Ontario continues to be critical to offset COVID-19 impacts on the city's operating budget. In the event that adequate provincial and federal funding is not forthcoming in 2022, there will be significant impacts on the city's ability to proceed with capital investments, and material adjustments to the capital budget will be required through a reduction in planned capital funding. Next slide, please. Similar to the operating budget, this slide shows how our capital plan is funded and where we invest those funds. So looking at how the money is invested, first I'll draw your attention to $13.4 billion investments in transit. This represents 44% of the total capital program and builds on investments committed to in prior years, where through the City Building Fund previously enabled us to double our historical investment in funding towards transit SOGR. Cities also committed to spending $3.3 billion in housing, coupled with a further $4.7 billion investment through foregone revenue in the form of land value and financial incentives. This funding will be used to support the development of 20,000 affordable homes, with the city's direct commitment now fully funded, and will move the city towards the goal of supporting 40,000 new affordable homes under the Housing TO Action Plan. To create the remaining 20,000 new affordable homes, we will require added investments from the federal and provincial governments. We're also investing a further $5.4 billion in transportation, $3.4 billion on the environment, and this includes initiatives within parks, waterfront revitalization, environment and energy, as well as the TRCA. Additionally, the capital plan was developed with a climate focus and includes capital projects with components dedicated to increasing climate resilience efforts and/or reducing GHG emissions, with total expenditures across our budget of $1.5 billion in 2022 and $15.5 billion over the next 10 years. And lastly, $5 billion across all other city programs and agencies such as real estate, emergency services, library, and technology services. The left side of the chart shows how our capital plan is funded. Debt funding totals $6.8 billion and benefits from the use of green and social bonds, while ensuring that our debt service costs remain under 15% in each year of the capital plan. The City Building Fund totals $6.4 billion and is the second largest source of capital funding at 21% and is applied against transit and housing initiatives. There's a further $3.7 billion in capital from current funding, and that reflects direct operating funding supporting our capital needs. And the remaining funding comes from the federal and provincial governments, capital reserves, and recoverable debt. Next slide, please. As mentioned, we've continued to grow our capital plan with significant funding directed towards our capital priorities in mobility, housing, and modernization. Within mobility, $882 million in funding has been added with key investments in our transit fleet, major transit capacity improvement projects, and investments in cycling infrastructure and trail and pathway expansion. We're also investing an additional $992 million in housing projects. The majority of the funding will be dedicated to achieving 10,000 units of affordable rental housing under the Housing Now Action initiative, fully funding the city's direct commitments to this initiative. A further $453 million will be invested in modernization initiatives, and this includes the Etobicoke Civic Center that is now fully funded and will support both the Housing Now initiative and the growth and development of the Etobicoke Center. Further funding will also be invested in the modernization of library services, systems, processes, and technology solutions. And lastly, significant investments of almost $900 million have also been made in other key areas, including fire fleet replacement, ferry vessel replacement, parks development, and infrastructure repair investments in areas such as roads and bridges, facilities and utility upgrades, and childcare centers. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, the capital budget was developed with a climate focus. In developing the capital plan, staff identified opportunities to leverage our $46.6 billion planned tax and rate supported capital investments over the next 10 years to support our goals of reducing GHG emissions and improving climate resilience, ensuring consideration of our infrastructure investments involved a climate focus as part of the decision-making process. Through these efforts, staff have identified planned investments in capital projects with components dedicated to these climate goals that add up to $15.5 billion over the 10-year planning period. This is evident in decisions that are being made in our investments in buildings, mobility and fleet, and water and waste, which reflect the main sources of the city's corporate emissions. The city's recommended fully electric ferry fleet replacement strategy is a great example of our climate focus, where we're able to leverage added capital funding to address a capital need while also advancing our climate goals and supporting our net zero strategy. And again, this approach in capital budgeting is further expressed in our building investments, our mobility investments, our investments in fleets, as well as those in water and waste budgets. Next slide, please. So, and lastly, stated good repair funding traditionally reflects the majority of capital spending within the city's 10-year capital plan. For 2022's budget, 51% of total capital investments are specific to stated good repair work. The city has made material gains in addressing SOGR needs over the last few years with key investments in areas such as transit and TCHC building repair. However, even with our continued focus and growth in SOGR funding, staff continue to project our SOGR backlog will grow over the next 10 years from $7.4 billion to $16.3 billion. Moving forward, the 2022 budget plans to continue to advance commitments towards critical stated good repair investments, with $23.2 billion invested in SOGR over the next 10 years, and this includes $760 million in added investments. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, 2022 is still a COVID budget. We're focused on managing our response and maintaining essential services. We're committed to keeping property taxes affordable at the rate of inflation while investing in key city building initiatives, laying a strong foundation for recovery. We're focused on economic and social recovery with support for small businesses and new investments of $135 million to build a prosperous Toronto for all, investing in equity and reconciliation, climate action, and health and well-being. Ultimately, we know that continued partnerships with the provincial and federal governments are essential to continuing to respond to and recover from the impacts of COVID-19. Next slide. So this slide just represents the budget schedule for 2022. The budget was launched on January 13th, and we're more than halfway through the process this year. City programs and agencies presented their budgets to Budget Committee over 3 days from January 18th to 20th, and we had an opportunity to hear from nearly 150 deputants from the public on January 24th and 25th. On February 7th, the city's Budget Committee had its last meeting to consider and approve the 2022 budget. Moving forward, the budget will be voted on tomorrow by the city's Executive Committee, and then on February 11th, and then ultimately by City Council in the following week on February 17th. Next slide. So I've been able to present an overview of the city's budget. I'm sure this is a lot of information to digest over a short presentation. So for more detailed materials for each city's program or agency's budget, including budget analyst notes, presentations, and briefing materials, please visit the city's budget website at toronto.ca/budget. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Stephen, for your presentation. I know that that was a very big presentation, lots of information. Stephen also delivered at probably 20,000 feet in the air. The city's actual budget is probably about 10 binders, very large, if it was printed. I also want to just acknowledge that, you know, it's a very difficult way for the committee members to really speak to the budget when we're sort of speaking in sort of, you know, high level platitudes and summaries. And so there may not be an opportunity for you to do a line by line review. And that is part of the more conventional budget process. So Stephen, I want to just frame that up for you so that any questions coming from the committee, you know, is largely speaking about the sort of the structural systemic pieces. Okay, so having said that, any questions for Stephen? And why don't we just do this in the interest of time and managing our time wisely? We'll open this section up for questions and comments, so you can sort of blend it together. Anyone? Okay, Susan, go ahead, kick it off, please.
I wasn't going to comment because I don't need to speak on every item, but I'm Susan Gapka, she, her pronouns, and want to thank the city staff, Steve, both for being here and presenting a very complicated, a very large budget, and for putting pronouns in your signature there on WebEx. So thank you for that ally support. Around capital, I had two questions and I can only think of one. One was around the capital repairs or capital and I think you talked on one of the slides. I didn't review it before the presentation because I don't think I had it, but around the rebuilding of community centers or recreation centers. And I think from an 2S LGBTQ and a trans specific lens, that somewhere it could be embedded that those have the gender neutral lens on it. We have some centers like the recreation center in Regent Park, the new recreation center, I think it's now called the Pam McConnell. There are some really strong, innovative ways to incorporate some of these new technologies, and we can't go rebuild all of the community centers at once, but because we have an aging infrastructure from post-war, from a long time ago, when I was younger, that as these are being restructured and rebuilt, that I really like to see it more trans and disability and all the intersections inclusive. And I had another comment, but it's not coming to mind. But I did thank you for putting pronouns in your for your presentation. Thank you, Councillor. I'm willing to move on.
Thank you very much, Susan, and great comments there. Anyone else to speak or to ask questions at this point? Okay, Laura, the floor is yours.
I will admit this is in part my ignorance of the topic, but I was wondering how the 2.9% for property taxes was calculated. And then if anyone in the room, it might not be you, I understand that rent increases are tied to the provincial government, but what form of advocacy or process or methods are being done to prevent that 2.9% being passed down to people who are in more vulnerable situations?
Sure, thanks for the question. So with regards to the 2.9%, the approach that we take when we develop the budget is we'll look at the consumer price index for the Toronto census area. And what we do is we look at the trailing average. So essentially we're looking at what is that monthly increase in inflation that we've seen over the last 12 months, and then what's the average for the year. So you'll have certain months where it'll be lower and certain months that'll be higher, but what we had for the Toronto area over the last 12 months was 2.9%. And again, that's a consistent approach that we take every year in developing our inflationary number. Now, as it relates to rents, I do know that when we have our residential property tax increase, there's different rates that we have for multi-residential as well. Multi-residential is held at 0. So there is no rate increase on our multi-residential units. I will need to go back and speak with some of our other staff in terms of some of the measures that are taken to ensure that we don't have costs passed on to our tenants. Unfortunately, I don't have that available top of mind, but I do know that there has been steps taken in the past to ensure that.
Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Anyone else with questions and comments? Stephen, I have Steve. I have one question for you. I mean, oftentimes we talk about the City of Toronto's budget incorporating an equity lens, and in many instances we know that an equity lens has to be intersectional. So we have to be able to sort of understand everyone's sort of social cultural locations, and then to make sure that the services, programs, and policies that we deliver at the city and create are going to be truly universally accessible. Can you just explain to all of us at the committee, how are you ensuring that there's an intersectional 2S LGBTQ lens over the policy that drives the budget creation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. And there's a lot of work that that's really been initiated, and I believe through a lot of your advocacy actually in past budget years in terms of establishing equity lens as part of the budget process. So financial planning, the division that I'm in, works very closely with staff and people in equity as well as SDF&A in terms of a process and a tool that gets created. That tool is intended to help inform not just decisions that are made in terms of items that are brought forward in the budget, but even as strategies or initiatives are developed throughout the course of the year, to ensure that that lens, and there's a list of questions that I know we have Janice on the line as well, who can probably speak to it in much better length than I can, in terms of all of the elements and aspects that are included in that tool to help try to flush out and ensure that we're addressing those barriers. And I know that we've brought that tool forward to other committees in the past to try to be able to explain how it's used and how it's applied. And it might be something that would be beneficial for this community for us to bring in a future meeting. But I'll turn it over to Janice, who can probably elaborate much better than I can on some of the detailed components of the tool itself.
Steve, thank you. Janice, before you speak, we are aware of the tool because Janice was so gracious in coming forward to give us a very close look at the tool. I guess my question, Steve, is like, how do you, as the one who actually compiles all the budgets and put it together, as the divisions submit their budget to yourselves within financial planning, you correlate all of that and then make a staff recommended budget to City Council and to the Executive Committee and through the Budget Committee. I'm just wondering, what does your division do specifically to ensure that that the intersectional lens was actually put into the divisional's preparation work?
Sure. So there's two pieces that are going to be critical in terms of some of the decisions that we make in terms of supporting the ultimate staff recommended budget. The first is going to be, as we're looking at, actually it's probably three. So I think one of the first things is we've had a change in terms of how we develop and establish budgets. One of the key principles that I spoke to is around preserving service levels. So we're doing everything we can to ensure that we're finding opportunities to be able to address the pressures we have without impacting service levels. But when business cases come forward to us, we look at the results of those tools and the information that's presented to us. And what we consider in any change is what impacts does it have on equity, and again, through that intersectional lens. And that's part of the considerations that we'll have. We've been fortunate not to have any reductions in services, but obviously that's a key consideration as we look at where there might be some reductions or changes in the way services are provided. So that's something we'll look at to make sure that any change that's in the budget doesn't have a negative impact. We're also looking then as well, when we look at our new and enhanced considerations, and one thing that we try to do is look at where we can make added investments to advance. And we'll use the results of the equity-based budgeting to try to be an added consideration when we're making decisions in terms of where staff are going to recommend advancements or enhancements to the budget. So that is one of the key considerations. And when we look through the list of what are the opportunities that we want to advance forward, we'll look both at what's legislatively required, what's operationally required, but then we look at what the equity impact is. And that actually plays a very large and significant influence in terms of where we make those investments, and hopefully that's evident where we see that $135 million that we're investing in new and enhanced. The other thing that we've done, and it doesn't quite come across, but I'm part of the work that we've done on it, is we've changed how we budget. In the past, there were budget targets that were initiated to all the divisions, and those budget targets were somewhat blind to the impacts that they would have on the different services that are offered. We've done away with those targets, and what we've asked all of the divisions to do is to ensure that when the budget comes forward, we're very clear in terms of what it's going to take to be able to protect our services, ensuring that we don't have you know, a children's services division or a public health division coming forward with reductions in their budgets to adhere to, you know, maintaining a budget to a zero or a certain target. So all of those things have been factored in terms of the decisions that we make. And again, with our key priority being around preservation of services, but then ultimately where we make those added investments, ensuring that we've got that equity lens. We're looking at ways to ensure that we're advancing city priorities and advancing challenges and then reducing barriers and how we make advancements in our budget.
Thank you, Stephen. That is the end of my time. Anyone else? Okay, so why don't we get to speakers? Anyone to speak or move a motion? Okay, I do have a motion, and Sylvia, I apologize. I just sent it to you, so it's a little bit late. I just, after all that queuing and asking you folks to send your motions in advance, and I just was very delinquent. So Sylvia, can you tell me if you received my motion? Okay, just got it.
Sorry, Chair, on the budget item, on this item?
Yes, that's correct.
I'm sorry, I have not seen your motion.
Okay, not a problem. Why don't we stand this down? I will come back to it in very short order. We could also, sorry, Steve, you'll have to stick around for a little bit if you like, or we can let you know what happens afterwards. But what we can do is move ahead to SafeTO. We have a presentation from city staff, and that presentation is coming from Scott McKean. He's the manager of SafeTO, Community Safety and Wellbeing Planning Toronto and the Justice Centers. Scott will be here to give us a presentation. I want to let you know that he's going to be speaking on two things. One is the SafeTO strategy, but under that is the Community Crisis Support pilot programs, which is the diversion from police on crisis calls, which I know this committee has a lot of interest in. So Scott, are you here? If you can just show yourself, and we'll give you presentation. Give you the presentation button. Hi, Scott. Welcome.
Great. Good morning, Councillor, and good morning, everybody. Grateful to be here. My name is Scott McKean, and pronouns are he, him. And I'm also joined by my colleague, David Absalom. And maybe, David, I'll ask you to introduce yourself as well.
Everyone, I'm David Absalom here. I'm a policy development officer with the Police Reform Unit. I also use he, him, hi, Susan pronouns.
Great. Thank you, David, and thank you, Councillor, for having us here, and thank you to the committee for having us here today. Really honored to speak to you today about the work of SafeTO, and also just great to see so many familiar faces here. I've worked with a number of people on the committee over the years and the work that I've done with the city. And so today we'll provide you a brief update about SafeTO, which is Toronto's 10-year community safety and well-being plan that was adopted by City Council in July of 2021, and the first year implementation plan was adopted last week at Council. So we'll provide you an overview of what SafeTO is. Then we'll get into sort of what are some of the priority goals and actions in the implementation of the first year of the plan. And then we'll sort of do a bit of a deeper dive on the Community Crisis Support Service as we work through. David has worked on both of the reports along SafeTO and the Community Crisis Support Service. And so David will be speaking on the Community Crisis Support Service this morning. The fundamental part, I won't spend a lot of time here, but there have been a lot of calls from community to reimagine the core elements of what community safety is and really shift our focus from a reliance on emergency response and build a culture of prevention. What we're aiming to do with SafeTO is really think differently about how we use the multiple different tools and mandates that we have in our system, how we bring them together, and most importantly, how they actually respond to the needs of those most adversely impacted by the negative elements of safety in our city. We want to think differently about safety by redefining our historic, sort of definition, which is often about crime and policing, to really thinking about the well-being of people, and again, inspiring a culture of prevention. Both, Mayor Tory, you heard him speak earlier, he has been a champion of this movement. Both Councillor Wong Tam and Councillor Ainsley, who are on this committee, have been champions of this. And, Chief Raymer has also been a champion of moving beyond our current historic thinking of safety and well-being. Additionally, community and safety and well-being has adopted and evolved in the city because of a number of things. Calls from the community to, think differently about how we think about safety, but also provincial legislation. And so under the Community Safety and Policing Act, every municipality in the province was mandated and legislated to develop a community safety and well-being plan. And so we've worked, across the city and across the province in many ways to look at sort of a number of different areas that sort of, that enable us to advance safety and well-being. And what, sort of what we did in Toronto was really we focused on engaging populations. And so, after considerable, issue-specific, place-based, population-based consultations with over 2,500 people across the city, 1,500 people who are sort of, committed to filling out surveys and running sort of engagement sessions, and then also a vast policing reform work that has taken place that David will talk about when he talks about the Community Crisis Support Service. We identified SafeTO, and what it is it's a roadmap. And so at its July 14th meeting, Toronto City Council adopted the plan, and basically, SafeTO is a roadmap that really brings together multiple sectors, multiple systems, people to think differently about safety. It provides a guide to us about how we can actually think differently and mobilize. And that has evolved into, 7 goals across 26 actions. So the goals are reduce vulnerability, reduce violence, advance truth and reconciliation, promote healing and justice, invest in people, invest in neighborhoods, and drive collaboration and accountability. And there are 26 actions across those goals that over the next decade, the city will aim to move to advance our safety and well-being agenda. And as part of that, I think earlier in the meeting, a number of comments have been made about other issues and questions to the mayor. So for example, I think Laura brought up the fact that, we need to be trauma informed. One of the goals in SafeTO is to actually evolve to become not only a trauma informed city, but a trauma responsive city. And to take that lens of trauma and weave it through how we operate our programs, how we engage community, how we, think about investments, and to really weave that through. Councillor Wong Tam has been sort of a champion of making sure that we apply a gender equity lens to this work and move it through. And so those elements are built into the plan over the long term as well. And earlier in the conversation, I believe Terrence was talking about, the sort of place-based elements, and, having worked with Terrence in a number of areas in the past, and knowing that Youth Without Shelter as an organization, there are inequities in terms of neighborhoods and where services are, either through oversaturation of services in some areas or lack of services in others. And so SafeTO also addresses those elements that were brought up in the conversation by, implementing really place-based approaches. And, we've heard really clear that community wants, transparent, accountable monitoring and reporting practices when it comes into this work. And so we've built that in. I won't touch upon all 26 actions because they're all pretty big pieces of work, but the city's committed to doing this, and council has endorsed and given staff a mandate to sort of move forward with this plan. The year 1 implementation plan that was unanimously approved by council last Wednesday is sort of broken down into 3 areas, and I'll talk about this and between David and myself. The first is there are 4 multi-year actions that contribute significantly to policy change and system transformation, and we'll break down quickly for you what those priority actions are. There are 7 specific initiatives that are enhanced or expanded that contribute to safety and well-being in the city. And there are a number of different areas that that the city is moving forward on through existing work, such as the efforts to advance a health and social equity-based response to the drug poisoning crisis. Looking at the implementation of the gender equity strategy and using that as a stepping stone to advance some of the work that needs to happen around gender-based and intimate partner violence, and in partnership with the Indigenous Affairs Office, looking about how we respond to calls for justice around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There are elements of like justice reform with our partnership with the justice centers. And a number of other actions that are under there. Within the first year of SafeTO, we will be building a sort of online portal to demonstrate all of the areas in which the city is advancing safety and well-being. And then there are some infrastructure actions, including the development of a SafeTO advisory and some intergovernmental components that are built into the plan. So what I'd like to do now is really just break down the 4 priority actions for year 1, and these are significant multi-year efforts that will begin in 2022. And so firstly, I'll pass it over to David to speak about the Community Crisis Support Service. We'll spend a little more time on that, and then I'll be very high level with the rest of the actions.
Scott, so the Mayor Tory touched on the Community Crisis Support Service pilot, but just to give a little bit of a background of how we got to that point, we thought it would be important to kind of lay that foundation. So as many of you on the call know, the current crisis system functions as a crisis management system rather than one that's preventative and proactive. Throughout the years, we've been seeing rapid increases in hospital emergency room visits for any type of mental health challenges, and also demand for treatment and support services. In addition to that, we've seen increased wait lists for intensive mental health case management. So over the past 5 years, Toronto Police Service has actually seen a 32.4% increase in person in crisis calls. And these are calls that they typically define as a person that's calling because they're experiencing some type of temporary breakdown of their coping skills and are reaching out for help. So the police have kind of become this default first responder of the mental health care system, with approximately 1 in 5 police interactions across Canada involving a person with a mental health challenge or a substance use issue. However, as many of us know on the call, this police-led response to addressing health issues often creates service barriers and risk for many Torontonians, particularly those that are Indigenous, Black, or part of other equity-deserving groups such as Two-Spirit LGBTQ+ communities. So we've heard from multiple community activist groups, residents of Toronto, that there is a community mistrust and a lack of confidence in a police-led response to those who are experiencing mental health crises, and that's led the city to start to think through how to reimagine a model of response that is non-police-led, client-centered, trauma-informed, and focused on reducing harm. Can I get the next slide, Scott? So to do this work, our team in December of 2020 engaged in a rather short but intensive period of community engagement and research. And our community outreach and engagement really prioritized those communities that have been most impacted by over-policing and have that lived experience of mental health or substance use challenges, and those who have had interactions with the justice system. So from October to December 2020, we completed around 33 community roundtables with counseling supports available. And these community roundtables were hosted by several community organizations across the city, including Black Cap, Two-Spirited People of the First Nations, Sherbourne Health Center, and the Toronto Trans Coalition, which was led by Susan, who's on the call today. In addition to that, we've also led some public surveys that ended up with over 6,000 responses. And then we also thought it was important to speak with those key subject matter experts to really get a sense of like what would a service for Toronto need and look like. So with that, with those subject matter experts, we really look to speak to those that are in the legal field, those that have mental health firsthand experience, lived experience, and then those who also work on the service provision side. And then those who are activists and have a academic expertise or focus in anything to do with like mental health related. Lastly, we conducted a public opinion poll with a representative sample of over 1,000 Torontonians. As we continue this work, we formed a alternative community safety response accountability table, which hosted 56 diverse organizations to help us in this work to really monitor and support the development and implementation of what this pilot could look like. Internally at the city, we've also conducted roundtables with the relevant city divisions and agencies, including first responders, such as Toronto Fire Service and Toronto Paramedics, and in addition to this, met with the Toronto Police Service. And because this is such a innovative pilot, we also look to other jurisdictions to think about how have other jurisdictions with similar demographics led this work. So our team reviewed about 56 crisis response models from 50 jurisdictions across Canada and internationally, including, the well-known models such as Cahoots. Our team has been lucky enough to sit down with the folks behind Cahoots to really pick their brain around their expertise of how to launch a service like this and what are some of the key learnings and considerations to move forward to that implementation piece. So can I get the next slide, Scott? So we just wanted to give I think we skipped a slide, Scott.
Sorry about that.
No. Oh, there we go. There we go. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a piece of how the pilots would work at a high level. So really a central intake partner, 211, would be the folks that would dispatch the calls to the appropriate pilot team. And the pilot teams would be anchored within a health service provider, such as a community health center. Mayor Tory had spoke a little earlier around who were the selected anchor partners, but we'll get to that in a bit. But these anchor partners would be responsible for the hiring and the managing of these mobile crisis teams and provide wraparound supports for any of the clients requesting service. Each anchor partner would also be responsible for the composition of the team. So the teams will be comprised of crisis workers who will respond to calls together to ensure mutual safety. And one of the key pieces that we heard from our community consultation piece was not to be prescriptive in what the composition of the teams look like. So for example, some jurisdictions have models where it's specifically a nurse and a social worker, but we heard from subject matter experts and those with lived experience, the need to have a more flexible composition of the teams and to let the anchor partners through community engagement define what those teams could look like. So the team members could potentially include a case manager, those with holistic or culturally specific mental health expertise, or community and population specific mental health outreach workers. So each anchor partner's composition of the teams will look a little different, but they'll all be trained to provide the same quality of services. On the city's end, the city's role really is to provide that backbone support. So the city will work towards further advocating for increased community investments in intergovernmental advocacy acts and lead and develop public education campaigns to prepare residents for this new service. In addition to this, we will be hosting a pilot advisory community table to really shape and guide the pilots throughout their implementation. And these tables will consist of mental health experts and key stakeholders and those with lived experience to be able to, again, while the pilots have begun to operate, lead them through that implementation and find any areas that need to be just tweaked and adjusted throughout the periods. Given that this is a pilot, we really want to take an iterative approach and consistently work towards improving the service excellence of it. And one of the key pieces for this work is really that evaluation piece. So a third party will be leading the evaluation and the monitoring and the knowledge mobilization piece, in addition to developing a community of practice around crisis support. So CAMH has been selected to be that third-party evaluator, and they are working on defining the ways to be able to, for the city to be able to test, learn, and adjust and refine the pilots based off of the data that they'll be collecting. And then can I get the next slide? So here we have the community anchor partners. So just to reiterate, Mayor Tory, so in the Northeast pilot, it would be Taboo Community Health Center, the Northwest CMHA Toronto, and then the Downtown East, the Gerstein Crisis Center, and the Downtown West, Two-Spirited People of the First Nation. And just to, oh, thanks, Scott. So just to highlight some of the key pieces for each one of these anchor partners, just like Mayor Tory said, with Taboo Community Health Center, we did select them based off of their Afrocentric approach to mental health and well-being. And in addition to this, they've actually partnered with other local partners to be able to provide additional culturally appropriate responses. With the Downtown East pilot, the Gerstein Crisis Center, they have been handling crisis work for over 30 years, so that expertise in doing this work is well appreciated. Then the Downtown West, the Two-Spirited People of the First Nations have provided or will be providing that Indigenous-led approach to harm reduction and providing a holistic health and wellness lens to the work that they'll be doing. And then with the Northwest, CMHA Toronto has really worked around developing those anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and culturally safe approaches to mental health response work. So I can just take a break here before we move on to the other priority actions to see if anyone has any comments, questions, or concerns around the pilots.
David, maybe just before we go, I think we should probably just wrap up our entire presentation and let everyone speak. And I'll fly through the rest because I recognize the time and I want to make sure we get to everyone's questions as well and wrap up. So just quickly, you know, we wanted to do a deeper dive on the Community Crisis Support Service, but I want to quickly tell you about some of the other priority actions within the first year. So based on some historic collaboration that's happened around the issue of gun violence, some of the work that's been ongoing over the years, but as well as some of the pilots we've run, we're recommending that we develop a Toronto office to prevent gun violence that really brings together multiple sectors and lenses to work collaboratively out of one space. To really systematically coordinate all of the gun violence intervention prevention programs in the city, to look at, you know, how do we actually integrate investments that the city has, as you know, with other levels of government, so they're actually working complementary, and you know, how do we actually use prioritize data and prioritize local knowledge to advance that. And so we'll be sort of building it out through a similar process to what David talked about and how the Community Crisis Support Service was developed. Really heavily engaged community in helping us figure that out. Along with that, we'll be enhancing the community crisis response and well-being recovery supports that the city is either providing or investing in. So many of you have worked with the city's community crisis response program that responds to violent and traumatic incidents. We'll be expanding the scope of that program so it can operate 7 days a week throughout the implementation of SafeTO. In addition, we'll be building on some really amazing well-being and recovery efforts that we've been piloting with 7 different organizations to be able to really enhance our supports for victims impacted by violent and traumatic incidents. Lastly, we'll be working with multiple sectors to develop a data center to better use data. So currently we use data to describe problems, and there's a lot of data in our sector. But in order, as this table has talked about already today, these issues are very complex, and we need to be able to look at data holistically and use multiple data sets and multiple lenses to look at how do we actually respond, and plan to better respond in these issues, and then how do we actually empower communities to use data in new ways to be able to tell the story of what they're doing, but also enhance local service planning. And so we're currently partnering with Toronto Public Health on this initiative, the Dalalana School of Public Health Population Health Analytics Lab with Dr. Laura Rosella, and Toronto Police Service, Statistics Canada, and a number of other partners to look at how does data come together and how do we use it more effectively. Lastly, SafeTO, we can't do this alone as a city. Some of the things that are required, as the table talked about earlier in the meeting, housing, you need all levels of government on board. Mental health, you need all specifically the province on board. We need the community sector embedded in this work and leading some of this work. And so we have an intergovernmental approach and a governance approach that'll help us advance this work on the onset. I'll leave it there because I know that there's a lot of questions. These are two massive, massive reports, and it's hard to get through in the 15 minutes. So thank you for your time and your energy, and we'll definitely take any questions that you have.
Scott and David, thank you for your presentation. We do now have probably a little bit of a time crunch, but I also know that what you've just presented to us is not just important work, but also historic work for the city, because we've never had these strategies placed before us before. So I guess to start the speakers list, again, I'm going to combine the questions and comments sections together. If you can just indicate your interest in asking a question or providing a comment, please raise your hand. I'm going to start by acknowledging Leslie. Leslie, go ahead, please. And Susan, thank you.
Thank you for your report. I'm glad to hear it. It's much needed. I have a very specific question regarding Pride Toronto. I sit on the board of Pride Toronto, and me personally, I've had problems in the past with police brutalizing me simply because I'm a lesbian of color, minding my own business. And things have improved, but there's always more room for improvement. I'm just wondering, now that we are having physical festivals back, Carabana also has had problems with the police, but I'm speaking now from the Pride point of view. Have you made a proactive effort to reach out to Pride to work with the crisis report, the community crisis support program?
I'll take the first part. I'll pass it to David. So what I can say is with SafeTO as a whole, we have reached out to Pride. They were part of Pride Toronto was part of the consultations that we did on SafeTO. And, I think as we build out the plan for SafeTO in its essence, one of the many principles that we have that were developed through our consultation to community was do no harm. And, as we implement SafeTO, that has to be front and center with SafeTO and also with the pilots. So David, maybe I'll pass it to you to speak about the pilots more specifically.
Thank you.
I think the one thing that I would add with the pilots are also based off of consent, so they're consent-based services. So with the pilots, if there are situations where a person is in distress or in crisis, and you or a bystander is requesting service, then yes, you can call both 911 or 211 to be able to get that support. But we have not had conversations with Pride to actually be physically at the festivals, just because the service is one that would be like dispatched from a community health center.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Next person to speak is Susan.
Hello, hello. This is a very ambitious plan, especially at executive. I'm Susan Gapka, because I should identify myself. I'm used to going to conventions where you come to the mic and identify who you are, but you know who I am by now. I hope, and I'm still using pronouns. Thank you for this massive project. And to think that it was at city executive as a combined agenda item, because but I want to thank the staff for everything you've done to get it to this point, especially under the duress of a pandemic. But these are opportunities to really set strategic plans for the next 10 years. My most important, I think not most, the thing that's on my mind, but Leslie has inspired me because we both sit on the seniors. Shh, don't tell anyone. Hope this isn't a public meeting. Don't tell anyone. I'm like an honorary member, okay? But is there a connection? So it just came up. Thanks. You gotta have fun with it, because the other options are not working out for me. But connection to a senior strategy, perhaps. I didn't see that in here, and Leslie has inspired me to be more conscious and others of that. And the second thing was I'm most interested in, I think, in evaluation. And so who's doing the data collection, what that data collection looks like, and who you're talking to. And I'm thinking from a 2S LGBTQ plus data collection analysis. So we're using men, women, non-binary, not male and female. I hope that's in there, but I can't. You never know. If you don't say it, sometimes it just doesn't get noticed. So, but I think the Trans Coalition was very specific on our need for that. And so, oh yes, and I have seen this. I just want to say I've had the opportunity to serve. I don't usually out myself, but I have been invited to the accountability table so I'm sitting on that table. That's moving forward. I do sit on the mental health and addictions panel, which has worked on these pilot programs. And so I've had I think that really speaks to the level of engagement that the city staff has developed in getting in such a short period of time. It was all hands on deck trying to get it done. So I just wanted to say I've seen this from a variety of angles. I do had some motions, but I think they've been incorporated into the councillor's motion that's coming forward when we get to that portion of the meeting. So just thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, yeah. So one last thing, the evaluation, I forgot because I don't have notes, is that the people impacted themselves be part of who is engaged, always engaged and partly driving it, is that be at the accountability table and be included in the evaluation, because we want to be able to measure where we're at now and where we're at in 6 months and a year from now and further. Thanks.
Great. I just wanted to identify quickly your comment about the senior strategy as one. There's over 60 strategies in the city that we've identified that advance SafeTO goals. The senior strategy is one, and we're working with the people who run that strategy. In terms of evaluation, from a SafeTO perspective, the data center will lead some of that work along with some lived experience advisory groups. And with the crisis support service, David, do you want to just talk quickly about the amazing evaluators you have?
Yeah, so just going off of Scott's point, so with the evaluation with CAMH and Shaw Makwa, which is an Indigenous-led organization within the PSP or within CAMH, they are working with the community anchor agencies, with our stakeholders, and with those who have lived experience to be able to put together an evaluation framework. So all of the pieces, Susan, that you've left around, whether or not it's pronouns, whether or not it's gender identity, and how that data will be collected has been included in that work. So, and I think when we're closer to having that evaluation framework finalized, that's something that may also be shared as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That was a really helpful exchange of information. Anyone else for questions or comments? Oh, wonderful. So we've got Lori and then Laura and Terrence. Go ahead, please.
I'm so excited to hear about this really important work moving forward. So thank you very much for your presentation today. It's wonderful to see all the community engagement that's already happening and that's planned. I just am aware that the term people with lived experience can mean a lot of different things when it comes to working with mental health communities. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about engagement of mental health service user and consumer survivor advocacy organizations as part of that process. Are those folks around the table, or can you just address that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think totally agree. People with lived experience is quite a wide catch-all term, and I think when we use that term, we are including those who have actual lived experience of substance use or mental health challenges, those organizations that also serve them, and then those who are a part of their support system, so both chosen family and biological family. And they've all been invited to the table in different ways to participate through the community engagement process. And moving forward with the implementation of the pilots, we're having the community advisory tables that each community anchor partner will be responsible for hosting, and they'll be invited to those tables as well. In terms of the throughout the implementation of the pilots at the community advisory table for our project as a whole, we did have all of the groups that you mentioned included. I know that's the word community quite a bit, so apologies if it's confusing.
Thank you, Lori. Do you have any follow-up questions or comments? Okay, great, thank you. Next to speak is Laura.
Hi, I love when we go together. My name's Laura. I use she and her. I'm also a member of Pikwakanagan First Nation, and I identify as two-spirited. I'm also an acute and intergenerational trauma survivor, so I really appreciate, and I do a lot of work around trauma-informed spaces and trauma-responsive spaces, so I really, really appreciate that being integrated in. I think it's missed in most DEI and equity lenses, which is too bad because you can't understand these communities without understanding the systemic trauma that has experienced. So thank you for that. I do want to flag one thing around my Indigenous community, or a couple, two things, I guess, which is I encourage you folks, if you do not have a two-spirit knowledge keeper or an elder, to invite them into your spaces to give feedback and help form some of that understanding. I say that because there is still a lot of colonial racism, sexism, and homophobia within our community itself. And so I know that I have, and many of the people who are two-spirited have had really negative experiences with some of our elders who still hold some views that are not, that are colonial in nature. So I would encourage that. And then the other piece I would mention is that is to work with the Indigenous community partners that you do have to make sure that, or to encourage them to work with elders who are flexible with some of their ceremony and protocol. I say this because while working with the Toronto decriminalization process, I talked to a lot of Indigenous peoples who identified the fact that they weren't allowed to participate in ceremony and healing ceremonies because they were on substances. So some elders will let you participate in ceremony no matter where you are in your process, and some elders require like a complete, like being completely off of it. And what we heard was that that was very harmful because people couldn't access services and access healing while trying to work through their drug problem. They had to already be completely off. And so I just encourage kind of some nuance in understanding the Indigenous-led, yes, making sure that also there's some questions around what that looks like as well.
100%. David, I'm not sure if you want to talk about the pilot partners that are from the Two-Spirited community.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that. And I think for all of the pilots, so I just want to make the distinction clear that yes, there is like an Indigenous-led pilot, but with all of the pilots, we're making sure that those who are Indigenous can receive care that is culturally relevant and done so in an appropriate way that respects their identity. So all of the pilots are being trained to be able to work towards the things that you spoke towards. In terms of the advisory committee, so the Two-Spirited people of the First Nation, as the Indigenous-led pilot has worked towards those pieces around who should be at the table in terms of elders and the community advisory, and works from a place of ensuring that like those nuanced conversations are happening. So while the pilot is set to launch within the next month, they are working towards having those nuanced conversations of what it looks like to provide service provision to those who may still be on their journey towards whether they're using substances or not, and also where they are in their mental health journey. So we are making sure that it's not just a one-size-fits-all approach to providing service provision, and really meeting people where they're at, and then being able to identify what are the specific needs of the service user and how the anchor partner and the team can provide the most appropriate care with their consent. So yeah, we are having those conversations, and it's kind of hard within these meetings to provide like that really like nuanced piece, but they are happening. Those conversations are happening.
Miigwech, thank you.
And just one last point to that is that within the SafeTO context, your comments about trauma, we will be looking to engage community. So definitely we'll connect with you on that. It's built right into the plan, but also the same principles that you asked will apply to how we use data. And so, with data for equity, Indigenous data sovereignty, and the terminology that's been brought up throughout the meeting will also be factored into how we use data in the implementation of SafeTO.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for bringing that very important issue to light. Our next person to speak is Terrence.
Hello, Terrence here. Pronouns. Good to see you again, Scott. Yeah, I have a little bit of insight on a lot of what's been presented as I work out of the health center, the Rexdale Community Health Center. So I've been hearing some of this as well. Not to mention, over the past 15 years of working in Rexdale, I've had a lot of experience in of a lot of this that's been going on. And that really made me think about this project, and I know it has been going on, and what concerned me initially was this reinvention of the wheel kind of thing that's been happening within our sector. I remember in 2007 starting at the ProTech Media Center, which was like the pilot for all the 13 neighborhoods we were going to install, and it was to try to address, some of these issues in regards to creating spaces for the community and building skills. And it was a great idea, but it fell through. And a lot of it had to do with politics, new governments, funding, lack of sustainability, and then also outside entities, these funders dictating what success looked like and creating those measurables, and it wasn't created by the community. So there's been a lot of things that have happened. Also, other programs like Breaking the Cycle was another really, really powerful program that also fell through. And so part of my, well, no, I guess my question is this over the years, seeing that we've learned a lot, we've had a lot of successful programs, there's been a lot of studies that have repeated a lot of the same information, and I've seen a lot of this reinventing of the wheel when it's not need be. What, I don't know how to word it exactly, but how have you worked into your plan to prevent that from happening? Because it really is just a waste of time, effort. It's such a sad thing that it's happening, and you know, communities continue to slip through the cracks because of these excuses that really just aren't good enough anymore.
Thank you very much for the question, Terrence, and the reality check. And as you know, I worked with you when you were at ProTech, so I know the story and legacy of that. And I think what's at the heart of this is we heard from communities a couple of things. Consistently across all consultations, no matter who we're talking about, people wanted accountability, they wanted transparency, they wanted the ability to participate and define what success looked like. So many of the things that you just talked about are things that we've heard about and are in the principles in SafeTO. And so, you know, it's such a complex plan, but I'll give you the example of the gun violence office because I know that we've worked in that space together. And as you know, there are a number of different things from what a ProTech Media Center was to, you know, police action and everything in between that prevents someone from, you know, being involved in gun violence. And so we've heard from community that they want us to really systematically integrate, you know, the different types of interventions that we have and tell the story about the role that they play, but also look at how the different kind of investments across government come together to advance our work on that issue. And you know, the only way you can do that is by defining and amplifying what you talked about locally is what does success look like for a community. And so we're embedding that into the office and making that sort of front and center in how we do this. And so, you know, current levers that the city has are things like the youth violence prevention grants that we have. So continuing that funding, council has committed to that on an ongoing basis. So then it's like, how do we actually just not have a bunch of programs out there doing what they do, but they're connected to the broader vision and the goal. And that's always been missing historically in the work. That's what we aim to do with SafeTO.
I think I would just add on. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead, David.
I think I would just add for the Community Crisis Support Service pilot, one of the key things that we've heard and we know is that there have been crisis response work that's been happening across the city for over 30 years. So really wanting to leverage the experiences of the leaders that have been doing this work, such as the Gerstein Crisis Center. So one of the key things that we heard was like, while there are other jurisdictions that are doing this work, we wanted that made in Toronto approach, and having those community organizations that have been doing this work for decades, really, to be able at the forefront to be able to work towards what a pilot for Toronto should look like. So really leveraging the experiences out there and building on that.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Scott, for your answer. Terrence, for your ongoing hard work, even outside of this committee. Obviously, there's a number of committee members who have intimate knowledge and also hands-on experience in informing the SafeTO plan. It's always quite an honor, to be honest, when I get to learn about the extraordinary work that you folks are doing. Is there anyone else who has questions or comments at this point? Okay, seeing none, why don't we move into to speakers and movers for motions. Anyone to speak? I know, Susan, you and I have been working on a motion. Maybe what I can do is tee it off. And I just want to ask Sylvia, our clerk, to put the motion onto the screen. This is a motion that I worked with Susan, and thank you, Susan, for your very helpful input. So I'm doing this on behalf of the two of us. And just wait for that motion. Okay, great. So as most of you are aware, Susan and I had a quick conversation probably just at the beginning about how to make sure that we can reinforce and enhance the work that SafeTO is doing, especially around the component that needs to be even further and more intersectional. And I want to recognize that, you know, the City of Toronto is obviously a sub-government. We are party to and to a number of sort of national and international obligations, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, the Truth and Reconciliation Call to Action, and even the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Action Plan. We want to make sure that all of those extraordinary bodies of work, which actually represents not just stories, but also actual factual data that's been collected, and strong recommendations that came from community voices are going to be incorporated into the work plan of SafeTO. So that at the foundational pieces, what we have is a strategy on creating community wellness and health that is going to really incorporate the voices of those who've been most historically impacted. And then further to that, I want to make sure that, and I think we all do, and hopefully I can speak on behalf of the committee, is that we're going to be asking that this work, SafeTO, and the subsequent policies and programs that fall under that category is going to ensure that there's an intersectional 2S LGBTQ lens. I don't think that we need to, I think we do need to reinforce it, to be quite honest, because outside of this committee, I can tell you that when it comes to LGBT representation and voices, despite all good intentions by the senior leadership, and I would include myself in that, it has to be constantly said and reminded. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen. And so therefore that work has to be included. And then further to that, I want to make sure that we can incorporate those community-based organizations. Scott, this is a specific piece regarding a conversation I had with organizations such as Black Health Alliance, who was who specifically felt some level of nervousness, to be quite honest, that perhaps the SafeTO program, unlike the community crisis response support program, did not have enough grassroots organizations feeding into the work plan and implementation from a localized perspective. I know that the intention is great, and we welcome those intentions, but it doesn't hurt to reinforce it and to be very specific with our purpose and outcome. At all the feedback that you've heard from our community members, to incorporate that into your the implementation and work plan as you roll forward, and to have the executive committee incorporate the recommendations that are specifically applicable to SafeTO from UNDRIP, from the National Inquiry Final Report, as well as the CABRB action plan, as well as the TRC call to actions. So we're going to be endorsing all of those important policies, but we're asking you to then deliver the outcome. And I think, sorry, Sylvia, you can put the motion down now. Thank you. I think, ultimately at the end of the day, this is a very important piece of work. We know how much time and energy has gone into it, but we also know that the provincial government has basically mandated that every municipality create a community wellness and safety plan. Ironically enough, it doesn't always come with money, so they're telling us to go do something which I think should be done, but it's also lacking of dollars. One thing I wanted to flag, and hopefully you folks can feed into it if it is something you agree to, but the community crisis support pilot programs are going to be successful with some limitations. And the limitations are, it is still a response program. Upstream is where we need to see the investments around housing, mental health, addiction support, pathways to recovery. If we don't get that upstream investment, we are going to have an overflowing shelter system that is at the breaking point of crisis. We're going to have more people living on our streets and perhaps facing undue harm and further stigmatization in communities. And of course, we're going to see the perpetuation and more gun violence, more gender-based violence. The pandemic has brought to light all of those challenges because we have not invested in the systems and the structures that keep people safe and keep people well. I know you know this, Scott and David. I know you know those. I know you know it well, but I can't let the moment go by without stressing that those investments are so critical. Otherwise, you're setting up all these community organizations, all four of them, all the policies and programs that you want to develop. It's not going to work. We have to get it upstream. Thank you very much, and thank you, Susan, again for your helpful participation in drafting the motion. Anyone else to speak? Susan, please go ahead. Susan,
Bingo, I was unmuted. It had to happen. I'm glad you spoke at length, Councillor long time because I was having an emotional moment. And I just want to like share with you folks, your friends, siblings, just what a difficult process this has been. I've been on the receiving end of mental health and addiction services, wandered the streets. Here I go. Wandered the streets for 10 years, and through some miracle of life, I come out the other end. I've been housed for 25 years. Now, coming up to 25 years, so I'm celebrating. Hopefully we won't be shut down on that by May. But on that, this has been some of the most difficult and hardest work to advise on. And so really just a huge thanks to everyone engaged in the process, City Council, this committee for being here to take the weight off of feeling alone. 2 years ago in the summer, or almost 2 years ago, most of my friends were marching in the streets, colleagues, and here I am trying to work collaborative with the city and Toronto Police Services to bring this to fruition. So this is really a major accomplishment of gigantic proportions, at least from my viewpoint. And I just really wanted to, I mean, this is our opportunity now for all of us to become engaged in creating a better city that has both SafeTO and I'll go with the crisis intervention systems. It's only the beginning of, so I wouldn't say the beginning, because that's false. There's been a lot of really good work going on for decades, but it's a step forward in the direction we want to see this going from community organizations and people like myself in the city. So I'm just like, yeah, we're moving in the direction I want to see us go. And I'm just very grateful to be here to share my thoughts with you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well said, Susan. Thank you very much for your, and actually, to be quite honest, for your courage in speaking the truth. Okay, wow, I'm feeling something now. Okay, anyone else to speak? No? Okay, so why don't we just take the motion and we'll just start to, we'll take a vote. All those in favor of the motion? Okay, any opposed? That carries. Thank you. Just heading back to the budget item, and I just realized that, just so you know, it wasn't so much that I was late in sending the motions. I realized I had 8 emails queued up in my outbox that was just not sending. So to our clerk, I apologize if it's coming through as an avalanche, but the clerk has also been incredibly patient with me because Sylvia has been asking me for my feedback and I haven't been able to provide it because I haven't been seeing her motions, her emails coming to me either. Sylvia, is the motion on the budget prepared now and ready to go?
Just based on your last email, I just need 30 seconds to update in
Great.
the system. One second.
Great, thank you. Scott, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate you and David for all that you've done.
Thanks for having us here. Have a great day.
Okay, so we're almost there, folks. I just want to, while Sylvia is preparing that motion, I just wanted to just acknowledge that May 19th is our very last committee meeting. I had always wanted to have a party for us, something that I've wanted to do, just have some sandwiches and some snacks, but that requires us coming together. So if the stars are aligned, and of course, if the health restrictions are lifted as anticipated, we could possibly be coming back together again. And that would be the very first time that this committee would have met actually in a committee room, which of course creates a very different dynamic, especially with side conversations, and we get to know each other a little bit better. And so I'll look forward to that. Okay. We can treat it as the unofficial Pride kickoff launch.
Sorry, I'm just having a technical moment. One second.
Well, Sylvia and I have been having challenges all morning. Interestingly enough, I think the meeting's still running pretty smoothly. It is remarkable how much work in preparation that takes place before we can actually get in front of the camera. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. I know it hasn't been easy. The clerk and IT staff make everything look easy, and every now and then there's a glitch. Maybe what I can do, Sylvia, is it okay if I describe the motion? Is that in order if I do that?
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be displayed in just 1 second. Okay,
great. So while Sylvia gets that ready for us, I can just pretty much read the motion to you. The motion is suggesting that the 2S LGBT Advisory Committee support the recommendation of the 519 budget submissions and to meet the community's express service level expectations and COVID-19 related costs. And then further to that, that the committee also asked the city manager to prove to us that an intersectional 2S LGBTQ lens is incorporated into the preparation and adoption of the city's operating and capital budgets, and to remove structural barriers that have historically excluded and harmed diverse 2S LGBTQ communities. I think it probably is fairly self-explanatory. In my chair's submission to you today, you can find it online. I did express that the 519 is looking for additional funds. This committee, of course, is going to be advocating for LGBT organizations that are doing good work to serve the community. I don't have to tell you how much work has gone into creating an LGBT response to COVID-19, some of the additional challenges regarding food security, community safety, well-being, access to services, especially when community centers, libraries, and all other community doors have shuttered. The 519 has continued to serve and hit above its weight. So, of course, there's now going to be a request for additional dollars, and it is up to us to try to move that money along. And then the other thing is that, oftentimes we have heard about, the city incorporating equity lenses over policies, programs, and services. And I know that with the best of intentions, including the smart tools that Janice is working hard to implement, sometimes it's hard to see the results. And I know that in your line of questions and comments today, is that you're probably experiencing the same thing. So when we do have the budget come before us, we have something that's called the equity impact statement. City Council can read that, but it doesn't really get into the quantums. So therefore, just by way of example, how many people are living in poverty below the poverty line or deemed as low income individuals who are two-spirited LGBTQ identified? Let's do a benchmark this year. What is our environmental assessment? Where are we today? And then next year, based on the implementation of programs and policies, has that number gone down? Have we directly impacted people's lives and lifted them out of poverty, diverted police calls that end in violent interactions? I think we need to start pushing for numerical assessments. So it's not just the fact that we have an equity lens and we sort of generally apply it, but rather demonstrate and prove to us that that equity lens that you've created actually is working, and we're going to get to better outcomes. So that's the nature of the motion. It's something that I have struggled with, even as a city councilor, I'll be very honest, at committees, standing committees, and at council, in ensuring that the programs and services that the city delivers and designs for citizens of Toronto are truly getting to people where they need to have them met. And because we don't oftentimes quantify that in terms of numerical valuations, it is very difficult to measure. So therefore, what we see is anecdotally, more people homeless, more people living in poverty, more people experiencing state and systemic violence. Then what have we done over the past 10 years if we have this equity lens? That is the motion. I'll leave it there, and just one final comment, I guess, is that the budget is the apex of every single policy tool. All the programs, action plans, strategies, vision statements are utterly words without budget considerations that are fully funded and that drive implementation, which is why I wanted to make sure that the budget was going to be presented to this committee today. Thank you very much. Susan, I see your hand up. Do you have a question of the mover?
I just wanted to publicly declare an interest on this motion. I hadn't seen it coming. So I won't be voting on this motion. Okay,
thank you very much, Susan. Appreciate that. Do you want to state the nature of your interest?
I guess it was bound to happen. I work casual labor at the 519, but I serve in this committee as a community member with the Toronto Trans Coalition. So I just want to be very clear on separating those two issues.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
So I would declare an interest so that I'm declaring it publicly now. Staff does know about this. We discussed this before when the appointment was made to the committee.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Susan, for your declaration. We appreciate that. So when it's time for us to vote, maybe you can turn off your camera and then we can proceed. Clerk, will we need a recorded vote?
Yes, I would recommend a recorded vote, and just we will require a declaration in writing as well. So following the meeting, Susan, I will send you a form, please, to fill out and submit back to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Okay. Any questions of the mover? No? Okay, seeing none, why don't we proceed? Sylvia, did you want to call for the recorded vote?
Sure. So this is on motion 1 by Councillor Wong Tam. When I call your name, if you could please state if you are in favor or opposed. Ashante Frey, and I believe marked absent. Burka Gupta. Okay, marked absent. Jad Jabber. I know that's absent. Jennifer White.
In favor.
Thank you. Councillor Wong Tam.
In favor.
Thank you. Laura McPhee.
In favor.
Thank you. Leslie Lee Kam.
In favor.
Thank you. Lori Ross.
In favor.
Thank you. Monica Forrester. I believe she might be absent. Councillor Ainsley.
In favor.
Thank you. Ranjit Kulatilak. And I believe he's had to leave as well, so absent. Samantha Peters.
In favor.
Thank you. Susan Gapka. Marked absent. And Terrence Rodriguez.
In favor.
Thank you. So, Chair, the motion carries unanimously with a vote of 8-0.
Thank you very much, Clerk, for that very helpful conduct of vote. We have, I believe, one more business item. It's not necessarily controversial, but we have to excuse the absence of some of our committee members. And if you do have to be absent, folks, just a friendly reminder to make sure you let us know so then we can make sure your name is on this type of motion. When you're ready, Sylvia, I think that's the end of the item.
Okay, so we'll put that up.
Okay, so I'm just going to read it, that the two-spirited Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer Advisory Committee excuse the absence of Burka Gupta and Jad Japper from the February 10th, 2022 meeting of the committee. All those in favor, indicate your support. Any contrary-minded? Okay, that carries. Okay, so that now, I believe, brings us to the end of our meeting, right? And we are excellent as a committee because we're so promptly on time with like 35 seconds to spare. I wish all of you very well. Please stay safe, and we will see you folks in May. And thank you to staff for all your hard work in the presentation and the support from IT and Clerk.
Kristen. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, folks.
Everybody stay safe and well.
Thank you, Counselor. You too.
You as well.
Everyone.